Welcome back to another story on Vision Harry. This time, we're bringing you, Neville told his Gran what Harry looked like after potions. Augusta arrived at Privet Drive. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1. The weight of it. The dungeon smelled like burnt hair and something chemical that had no business existing in nature, and Harry Potter was fairly certain that at least one of those smells was coming from him. He sat at his workbench and kept his eyes on his cauldron and tried very hard not to exist in a way that Snape might notice. It was a skill he'd been developing since September of first year, the art of being present without being visible, of breathing quietly, of keeping his hand steady even when his pulse wasn't. He'd gotten reasonably good at it. Not good enough, apparently, because Snape's robes were already sweeping in his direction with the particular velocity that meant someone was about to have a bad morning. Neville, 2 seats to Harry's left, had gone the specific shade of white that meant he'd already accepted his fate. Longbottom. Snape's voice landed on the name like a boot on wet gravel. He stopped behind Neville's stool and looked down at the cauldron with an expression of theatrical suffering, as though the contents had personally offended him. What is that? It wasn't a question. Neville's hands went very still on his stirring rod. It's the strengthening solution, sir. Is it? Snape leaned forward slightly. The potion in Neville's cauldron was a muddy brownish-orange where it should have been a clear pale amber. And at what point in Borgia's introduction to this potion, which we have read twice in this class, Longbottom, twice, does it suggest the color of river sediment as an acceptable outcome? Neville's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The knotgrass, Snape said, his voice dropping into something almost conversational, which was somehow worse than the theatrical version. You added it before reducing the heat. Didn't you? I thought, you thought. Snape straightened up. 10 points from Gryffindor for thinking, Longbottom, since your thinking has produced something that would strengthen nothing except perhaps the argument that certain students should not be trusted near a heat source. A few people laughed. Pansy Parkinson, mostly. Draco Malfoy smiled at the surface of his own cauldron with the satisfied air of someone who hadn't needed to do anything. Harry looked back at his own potion. Pale amber. Correct. He'd been precise tonight in a way that was almost desperate, because being correct was the only armor he had down here, and even that wasn't really armor at all. He heard Snape move. He heard the robe stop behind his stool. He kept his eyes forward. Potter. The word arrived the way a cold draft arrives, you feel it before you understand where it's coming from. What is the purpose of the powdered bicorn horn in this particular preparation? Harry knew the answer. He'd read the chapter 3 times because he always read the chapter 3 times for potions, not because he enjoyed it but because he had learned early that Snape would find a gap in whatever he knew and widen it. It acts as a magical catalyst, sir. It accelerates the absorption of the strengthening agent into the base without destabilizing the. I didn't ask for an essay, Potter. I asked for the purpose. Snape moved around the bench so he was standing beside Harry now, looking down at his cauldron with an unreadable expression. Though I suppose we should be grateful you read something. Your father certainly never bothered. Harry said nothing. It was the smartest thing he could have done, probably. It was also extremely difficult. Your potion, Snape said, picking up the ladle from the edge of Harry's station without asking and running it through the surface of the liquid, appears to be almost acceptable. Don't let it go to your head. The fact that you've managed the minimum standard for a 15-year-old student is not the achievement you seem to think it is. I didn't say anything, sir. Your face said it. Harry looked at the wall directly ahead of him. Snape set the ladle down. Stir it counterclockwise. 7 times. You've been going clockwise for the last 4 minutes and it's beginning to clarify unevenly. He paused, and Harry reached for the rod, and then Snape said, very quietly, in a voice that only carried as far as Harry's ears, your father used to make the same mistake. Imprecision dressed up as confidence. It's hereditary, apparently. The rod slipped. It was minor, barely a half second, a small loss of grip, but the edge of it caught the rim of the cauldron at an angle and a thin jet of the potion spat upward and caught Harry across the left side of his jaw and neck. It wasn't boiling. It was warm, almost unpleasantly so, and then it wasn't warm at all because the strengthening solution at the wrong concentration acted as a mild irritant, and what Harry felt, quite suddenly, was a sharp, spreading burn across the side of his face like someone had pressed a hot coin against his skin. He didn't make a sound. He reached up and pressed his sleeve against it and kept his expression absolutely neutral and stared at the wall. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Take more care with your equipment, Potter," and swept away toward the front of the classroom. Hermione, across the bench, was already reaching into her bag for something, didn't he? Probably, she carried it everywhere since second year, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was furious but had calculated that expressing it would make things worse. Ron, beside her, had gone a particular color that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the kind of anger that doesn't have anywhere to go. Harry accepted the "didn't he" from Hermione without looking at her. He dabbed it against his jaw. The burn dulled to a throb. He finished the class. He handed in his sample at the front without meeting Snape's eyes, which was fine because Snape wasn't looking at him either, and then he walked out of the dungeon and up through the castle to the Great Hall for lunch and sat down and ate half a sandwich and didn't say anything for a while. Ron put a full plate in front of him. Hermione sat close, not touching him, which was somehow more considerate than touching would have been. "He could be reported," Hermione said eventually. "What he said about your father." "That's not, there are rules about that, Harry. Personal attacks on students, it's in the school charter, which Dumbledore enforces," Ron said flatly. He wasn't usually the cynical one. It sounded wrong in his voice, like a coat that didn't fit. "Really effectively." "Obviously." Harry ate another bite of the sandwich. "I'm fine," he said. He said it the way he always said it, not as a reassurance but as a full stop, a period at the end of a sentence, a signal that they could stop the conversation here if they wanted to and no one would have to feel worse. They both heard the full stop and both ignored it, which was the thing about Ron and Hermione that he could never quite prepare himself for, the way they refused to accept the shape of the box he tried to put himself in. "The burn still visible," Hermione said quietly. "I know. I have more, didn't he? I know." He looked at her. "Thank you. I'm fine." She pressed her lips together and said nothing else, but she refilled his pumpkin juice and pushed the chicken toward him, and that was, in the vocabulary they developed over 5 years, quite a lot to say. Neville had been sitting at the far end of the table and had said nothing at all throughout lunch, which was unlike him in small ways and exactly like him in large ones. He'd eaten his food methodically, staring at it rather than at anything else, and he'd looked up once when Harry sat down and something had passed across his face, not pity, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something more complicated and more personal. He carried it through the afternoon's classes. Through Transfiguration, where McGonagall was brisk and demanding and the lesson was a genuine challenge that took most of his concentration. Through History of Magic, where Binns droned and Neville's quill moved across his parchment but his eyes weren't really following anything. Through the walk back to Gryffindor Tower in the early winter dark, when the corridors were loud with students released from the afternoon and Neville walked at the edge of the group and thought. He was thinking about Harry's face. Not the burn, though that had been bad enough, watching the potion catch him and watching Harry just absorb it, the way he absorbed everything, like a person who had long ago decided that reacting was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was thinking about the moment before the burn. The moment when Snape had leaned in close and said something in a low voice that Neville hadn't been able to hear from 2 seats away, and Harry's grip had slipped. Harry's grip never slipped. Neville had known Harry Potter for 5 years. He'd watched him face a troll, survive a dragon, navigate a maze, come back from a graveyard. Harry's hands shook sometimes, Neville had seen it, in the quiet moments, in the common room late at night when he thought no one was watching. But his grip on things never slipped. Not in the middle of doing something. Not like that. He thought about this on the train home for the Christmas holidays, tucked into a compartment with Seamus and Dean, while outside the window England went grey and flat and gradually white at the edges. He thought about the burn on Harry's jaw at breakfast the next morning, faded mostly but still pink at the center. He thought about the way Harry had said "I'm fine" with such practiced ease that you could almost believe it if you didn't know what effort went into the saying of it. He thought about his Gran. Augusta Longbottom was, in Neville's experience, a person who inspired specific and finely tuned anxieties. She had opinions about everything: his school performance, his posture, his wand work, his choice of friends, the way he held his fork, and she expressed them freely and without concern for their recipient's emotional state. She loved him, he was reasonably sure of that, but her love expressed itself primarily as a form of high-pressure accountability that left him feeling, most of the time, like a project that was not going well. But she was also, and this was the thing that was occurring to him now, working its way slowly to the surface, someone who had never, in his entire life, been afraid of anything. Not once. Not of ministry officials or school governors or the families whose names made other people lower their voices. Not of the memories she carried about what had been done to her son, which she had never softened for Neville's benefit, which she had always presented to him directly and clearly, because she believed in truth as a form of respect. Not of any person who had ever stood in her way. The train pulled into King's Cross. Gran was on the platform in her green hat and her traveling cloak, and she looked at him over the crowd with that sharp assessing look she used that always made him feel like she was checking something off a list, and he thought, she'd want to know. He thought about Harry. He thought about Harry's hands. He thought about the way the dungeon smelled like burnt hair. He walked toward her. She said, "You're thinner," by way of greeting. "I'm the same," he said. "The same as what?" "The same as someone who hasn't been eating properly." She took his trunk with the decisive motion of someone who had not asked for it and was not requesting permission. "The school food, it's good," he said. "Gran." He stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, and something in his face must have been different, because her own expression changed, not softened, exactly, but sharpened into a different kind of attention. The kind that was less about evaluation and more about listening. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. He told her over dinner. Not immediately. Gran had standards about what happened over dinner, and what happened over dinner was polite conversation and adequate portions and no distressing topics introduced before dessert. So they ate lamb chops and roasted potatoes, and she asked about his grades in herbology, which were excellent, and in transfiguration, which were improving, and she told him about her friend Enid's hip replacement and the drainage problem in the West Garden, and Neville ate his food and waited. The pudding arrived, jam roly-poly, the house elf's best attempt at festive, and Gran poured tea and settled back in her chair with the composed look of someone prepared to receive information. "It's about Harry," he started. Gran made a small sound. Not dismissive, attentive. Harry Potter occupied a specific category in Augusta Longbottom's mental filing system. She had met him once, briefly, the summer before third year, when she dropped Neville at the leaky cauldron, and she'd looked at Harry with an expression that Neville had not been able to read at the time. He could read it better now. It had been recognition. "The potions professor," Neville said. "Professor Snape." "Yes." Neville stopped. "He organized it. He'd been organizing it on the train and through the lamb chops, and there still wasn't a way to say it that felt adequate. He makes lessons difficult. For Harry specifically. For me, too, but for Harry it's," he stopped again. Gran waited. She had, beneath the impatience and the standards and the relentless expectations, infinite patience for things she had decided mattered. "It's not just difficult," Neville said. He makes comments. About Harry's parents. About his father. Personal things, in front of the whole class, so everyone hears. And there are points taken for things that aren't, they're not real infractions. He looks for reasons. He was aware he was making it sound smaller than it was. He was aware that his vocabulary for this kind of thing was limited, because this kind of thing hadn't happened to him, not in the same way, and he wasn't Harry and he didn't live inside it. Today Harry's potion was correct. I saw it. It was right. And Snape told him it was barely acceptable, and then he said something, quiet, so only Harry could hear, and Harry's grip slipped and the potion burned him. Gran's teacup stopped halfway to her mouth. His face, Neville said. The left side. It was still pink this morning. He kept going. He just keeps going, Gran. He doesn't say anything to anyone about it, and he says he's fine and he's not fine, he hasn't got anyone at home either, you know that, he lives with his aunt and uncle and he stopped himself from saying awful because it felt like overstepping, except it didn't, it felt like the truth. They're not kind. Gran set down her teacup. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled once, loudly, and then subsided. How long, she said. Her voice was entirely level. Since first year. That's when I saw it. It was probably before that. The burn today. Yes. Did he receive treatment? Hermione gave him, didn't he? A student. A student gave him, didn't he? She said it not as a question but as a thing she was placing carefully in a particular mental category. The matron would've, but he didn't go. He never goes. He doesn't want to make, Neville tried to find the word. He doesn't want to make things worse. He doesn't want the attention. He's very good at being small, Harry, when he needs to be. Better than anyone should have to be. Gran was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the fire. Neville watched her. He'd been afraid to tell her, going back and forth on the train between she should know and what if she does nothing, what if she just says Hogwarts is what it is and I've gone and made it feel bigger than it is and embarrassed myself. He'd been afraid she'd dismiss it. He'd been afraid she'd lean back in her chair and say something brisk about resilience and the difficulty of school and the importance of not being soft. She didn't say any of those things. What she did was stand up. Not quickly, Gran didn't do anything quickly that she hadn't chosen to do quickly. She stood with the deliberate controlled motion of a person who has just made a decision and is implementing it. She walked to the writing desk by the window and pulled open the drawer and found parchment and a quill and said, without turning around, "Is there more? Is this everything, or are there other things?" Neville thought about it seriously, because she deserved a serious answer. "There's the scar," he said. "The one Voldemort gave him. In the summer before 5th year he told me it had been hurting. He gets these dreams, I think. He doesn't talk about it. But you can tell." He paused. "The Ministry doesn't believe him about what happened in the graveyard. About you-know-who. They've been running stories in the Prophet, calling him a liar, basically. And Dumbledore's not," he stopped. Gran turned. "Not what?" "Not telling him anything. Harry says Dumbledore won't even look at him. This whole term. Something changed after the graveyard and Dumbledore Harry doesn't know what's happening, what the plan is, nothing. He's in the dark." Gran's expression was not anger. It was something colder and more focused than anger. It was the expression of a woman who had done the math and arrived at an answer she'd suspected but needed to confirm. She turned back to the desk and began writing. "Who are you writing to?" Neville asked. "No one yet." She wrote 3 short lines and stopped and read them back and then set the quill down. She stood there for a moment with her hand resting on the desk. "Neville." "Yes." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that he had not often seen and which was, for that reason, remarkable. She looked, proud wasn't exactly right. It was something less comfortable than pride and more specific. Like she was seeing him clearly for the first time in a while, or like she was comparing him to something and finding the comparison favorable. "You were right to tell me," she said. He didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Right. You were right and it took courage, and I know you're aware that I don't offer that word casually." "No," he said. "You really don't." Something that was almost a smile crossed her face. She picked up the quill again. I'll need the Potter boy's address. Neville blinked. Why? Because I intend to visit him. She said it the way you might say I intend to have another cup of tea, entirely matter of fact, entirely certain, as if the idea of this being unusual or complicated or potentially problematic had not occurred to her and wouldn't survive the attempt at introduction. Over the holidays. Presumably he'll be at his relative's house. You said Little Whinging. Surrey, Neville said slowly. Privet Drive. I don't know the number. I can write to Ron, he'll know. They tried to rescue Harry from there in second year. Write to him tonight. She set the quill down again and picked up her teacup. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway, the way she always did, without complaint, because the temperature of tea was not the sort of thing Augusta Longbottom considered a problem worth acknowledging. And Neville. Yes. Don't tell Harry. She met his eyes steadily. Not because I'm keeping secrets from him. But because if you tell him, he'll spend 2 weeks trying to talk you out of it, and by the time I arrive he'll have assembled 17 reasons why I shouldn't have come and he'll be standing at the door in a state of preparatory apology. I'd rather he had none of that. Neville opened his mouth. I want him to have the thing itself, she said. Not the anticipation of it. The thing itself is what matters. Neville closed his mouth. He thought about Harry. He thought about Harry's face in the dungeon. He thought about the particular skill Harry had developed for being small in spaces where people wanted him to be small, and the particular exhaustion that must take, the way a constant low-grade effort hollows you out slowly, the way you don't notice what it costs until someone offers you an alternative. All right, he said. She nodded, finished her tea, and set the cup down with a crisp decisive click. Good. Now eat your pudding. You're thinner than last term and I wasn't being dramatic about it. He wrote to Ron that night, keeping it vague. Gran wants to visit Harry over the holidays, just needs the address, don't make a big thing of it, and the reply came back in 2 days in Ron's large looping script, 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Why is your Gran visiting Harry? Is everything okay? Fred wants to know if she's going to hex the Dursleys. He says he hopes she hexes the Dursleys. Gran read the letter over Neville's shoulder without being invited to, which was one of her standard practices, and made a small sound of what might have been amusement. The Weasley boy, she said. Fred. Or possibly George. Hard to say which one was hoping for the hexing. She straightened up. The sentiment is understandable. She picked up the quill from the kitchen table and said, finish your breakfast, and went to write something at the writing desk. Neville ate his toast and listened to the scratch of the quill and tried to imagine what Augusta Longbottom intended to do when she arrived at 4, Privet Drive and could not quite get the image to resolve into anything fully coherent. It was too unprecedented. It was like trying to imagine what happened when 2 kinds of weather that had never occurred in the same place before collided. He thought it was probably going to be extraordinary. He thought Harry was going to be completely unprepared for it, in ways that had nothing to do with Privet Drive and everything to do with the fact that no adult had ever looked at Harry Potter and decided, this is mine to fix, I'm going to fix it, without something else being attached, without a prophecy or a war effort or a greater purpose that Harry's well-being was incidentally adjacent to. Gran wasn't going because of the war. She wasn't going because of Voldemort, or the Ministry, or what Harry represented to the wizarding world. She was going because Neville had told her that a 15-year-old boy had been burned in class and gone home with dignity from a classmate because the idea of asking for more help than that didn't fit inside the shape of who he'd had to become, and Augusta Longbottom had heard that and stood up. That was all. That was the whole reason. It was, Neville thought, more than enough. He went to bed on Christmas Eve in his childhood room with its herbology posters and the small collection of Mimbulus Mimbletonia specimens on the shelf and thought about the train ride, about Harry eating half a sandwich and saying I'm fine with that absolute practiced smoothness, and about Hermione pushing the chicken closer, and about Ron's face going the wrong color because he couldn't put his anger anywhere useful. He thought about Snape saying something low and private and the grip slipping, and he thought about the years and years of that, the accumulated weight of it, landing blow by blow in lessons twice a week since they were 11, and Harry just absorbing it and never saying stop because he'd learned that saying stop didn't work, that the only thing that worked was endurance, that endurance was the only language available to him. Not anymore, Neville thought. He didn't know exactly what Gran was going to do. But he knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had lived his whole life in the presence of Augusta Longbottom's particular variety of relentlessness, that whatever she intended, she would do it completely, without softening or hesitation, and that she would not stop until she had done it. Harry, he thought, had no idea what was coming. For possibly the first time in years, this was an excellent thing. Outside, the December wind moved through the bare garden and rattled the windows, and somewhere south of here, under a grey Surrey sky, for Privet Drive sat in its neat row and Harry Potter was spending Christmas in a house where no one was going to bat for him. For a few more days. After that, Neville smiled in the dark, just slightly, and closed his eyes. After that, all bets were off. Chapter 2, Privet Drive. The 27th of December arrived at 4, Privet Drive the way most days arrived there, grey, quiet, and structured around the avoidance of anything interesting. Vernon Dursley had his routine. Petunia Dursley had hers. Dudley had his television programs and his telephone and the particular brand of sprawling adolescent boredom that filled whatever space it was given, which at Dudley's scale was considerable. Harry had his room. He'd spent most of the holiday in it. Not because he'd been told to, not explicitly, not this year, though the expectation was ambient and did not require articulation, but because it was the path of least resistance and Harry had become, over 15 years of practice, very good at finding the path of least resistance inside this house and walking it without making noise. He did his homework. He fed Hedwig. He read through his defense textbook twice even though Umbridge's class was useless and the textbook was worse, because the reading occupied his hands and his eyes and left only the back portion of his mind free to run through things he'd rather not run through. The back portion of his mind was busy. It was always busy these days. It had things to work through, the graveyard, the dream that kept coming back with its green light and Cedric's voice, the scar that pulsed at odd hours like a second heartbeat that didn't belong to him, Dumbledore's face carefully angled away for an entire term, the prophet's headlines that he tried not to read and kept reading anyway. He filed these things. He managed them. He was, in the vocabulary of people who'd had to develop this skill early, coping. He was at his desk on the morning of the 27th, working through a transfiguration essay that wasn't due until February, when Hedwig moved on her perch and made a low sound, not her usual sound, not a letter incoming sound, but the sound she made when something outside the window was worth paying attention to. Harry looked up. He saw the cab first. It was a black cab, which was unusual for Privet Drive. The neighbors arrived in their own cars, which were a particular kind of clean and mid-range that signaled adequate prosperity without ostentation, and it had stopped directly in front of the house. Harry watched through the curtain as the door opened. An elderly woman got out. She was tall, more imposing than her height alone explained, with the kind of posture that suggested familiarity with being the most formidable thing in whatever room she was in. Her traveling cloak was dark green and cut with precision and her hat had a stuffed vulture on it and she carried a handbag that looked as though it could withstand a moderate explosion. She paid the cab driver with the decisive efficiency of someone who had calculated the fare in advance and didn't intend to discuss it, and then she turned and looked at the house. Harry's brain was still working through why she looked familiar when she lifted her chin slightly, surveying the front garden, Vernon's roses, neatly mulched, the ornamental gnome that Petunia had bought because the neighbors had one, with an expression of a person who has been given information in advance and is confirming its accuracy. Neville's Gran. Harry sat back from the window. Augusta Longbottom. He'd seen her once, from a distance, at King's Cross, and twice in photographs in the Prophet at various Wisengamot functions. She walked up the front path at the measured pace of someone who was not approaching a house but was approaching a situation, which was a different thing entirely, and rang the doorbell. Harry was aware, in some specific and confusing way, that he should go downstairs. He was also aware that his legs were not particularly willing to do this immediately. He sat at his desk and listened to the sound of the bell going through the house and the sound of Petunia's heels on the hallway floor and the sound of the front door opening. He heard his aunt say, "Yes," in the voice she reserved for people who might be selling something. He heard Augusta Longbottom say, "My name is Augusta Longbottom. I'm here to see Harry Potter. I shan't be long." The silence that followed had a specific quality. It was the silence of Petunia Desley processing a situation through several filters simultaneously, the accent, refined, authoritative, not the sort you argued with on a doorstep, the name, magical, therefore categorically unwelcome, and the manner, of someone for whom the word shan't was not an affectation but simply how sentences were constructed when one was being economical. "Harry doesn't, he's not," Petunia started. "He's upstairs," Augusta said pleasantly, and stepped inside. Harry heard this and stood up. He was down the stairs in seconds, not because he'd decided to be but because his body had decided for him, and he arrived at the bottom of the staircase to find Augusta Longbottom standing in the Desley hallway looking around it with the systematic attention of someone cataloging evidence. Petunia stood 2 feet away with her hand still on the door and her expression caught between outrage and a specific social terror that came from not knowing the correct way to eject someone who had the bearing of minor aristocracy. Augusta turned when she heard him on the stairs. Her eyes moved over him with the same systematic attention she'd given the hallway, except the hallway had held her attention for perhaps 3 seconds and she gave Harry considerably longer. Not in an uncomfortable way, it was the look of someone doing an honest assessment rather than a judgmental one, which were related activities with different intentions, and Harry, who had been assessed judgmentally his entire life, felt the distinction immediately. She took in the clothes that were 2 sizes too large. The faint mark on his left jaw, faded now to something you'd only catch in direct light. The way he'd stopped on the bottom step without quite committing to entering his own hallway. "Harry," she said. Her voice was measured and entirely direct. "I'm Augusta Longbottom. Neville's grandmother. I apologize for arriving without warning, that was intentional and I'll explain why in a moment." She glanced at Petunia. "Somewhere we can sit, please." Petunia said, "This is very irregular." "Yes," Augusta agreed. "It is. Where can we sit?" There was a quality to the way she said it, not rude, not aggressive, simply so completely certain that a place to sit would be provided that any alternative became somehow unimaginable. Petunia's jaw worked for a moment and then she turned and led them to the sitting room with the stiff mechanical movements of someone doing a thing they violently object to while being unable to identify the mechanism of their own compliance. The sitting room was immaculate. The Desleys' furniture was plush and aggressively ordinary, chosen to reassure rather than to please. Augusta looked at the settee, assessed it, and sat down on it with the same composed self-possession she'd have applied to a throne or a park bench. Harry sat in a chair across from her. He didn't know what he was feeling, exactly. It was several things at once, layered in a way that made individual identification difficult. There was something cautious in him, the reflex of a person who has learned that unexpected visits from adults arrive with unexpected complications, that warmth from authority figures has historically been a preliminary to something else. And underneath that, something quieter and more confused, which was the part of him that had watched Neville's grandmother step through the door of this house and say, "I'm here to see Harry Potter," as if Harry were simply a person worth visiting. As if he were simply a person. Petunia had stationed herself in the doorway. Her hands were folded in front of her and her expression had graduated from social terror to something harder. "I don't know what business you think you have here," she said. "But Harry is perfectly, I'd like to speak with Harry," Augusta said, "and I would prefer to do so without an audience. However, if you choose to stay, you're welcome to hear what I have to say, and you may find some of it relevant." The delivery was so unruffled, so entirely free of either hostility or deference, that Petunia simply stood there for a moment and then sat down in the other chair with the bewildered air of someone who had been outmaneuvered without being able to identify the moment it happened. Augusta turned back to Harry. "Neville told me about the potions lesson," she said. Harry went very still. "He didn't betray your confidence, you hadn't offered him one." He observed something that troubled him and he brought it to me, which is what you do when you observe something that troubles you. She looked at him steadily. He told me about Professor Snape's behavior. He told me about the burn. It's fine, Harry said. It was minor. I know you're going to say it's fine, Augusta said. I'm not here to be told that it's fine. The sentence arrived with such calm and such precision that Harry's prepared continuation, it was really nothing, I've had worse, it was just a small accident, simply evaporated. He sat there with the shape of the sentence still in his mouth and nowhere to put it. Then why are you here? He asked. He didn't mean it to come out with the bluntness it arrived with, but Augusta didn't seem to find it rude. She seemed to find it reasonable. Because Neville described something to me that I recognize, she said. And because what I recognized required a response, and I am the person available to make it. She folded her hands in her lap. When you are in a position to do something, Harry, you do the thing. That is the beginning and the end of it. Harry looked at her. He was 15 years old. He had faced a basilisk and a dragon and a man who shared his blood and a dark lord in a graveyard, and none of those things had prepared him for the sensation of sitting in a chair in the Dursley sitting room and being looked at by an old woman who had come here, not for Dumbledore, not for the Order, not for the war, not for any of the elaborate reasons adults usually appeared in his life, but because Neville had told her something was wrong and she had gotten up. I have some questions, she said. You don't have to answer them. But I'd like you to consider that anything you tell me won't be managed or filed away. I'm not Dumbledore. I'm not the Ministry. I'm a private individual with no agenda beyond the one you're sitting in front of. Something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Very slightly. What kind of questions? Harry said. Direct ones. She reached into the handbag, it was a very large handbag, and produced a small leather notebook and a quill, which she uncapped without ceremony. How long has Professor Snape's behavior been at the level you witnessed last week? Not the occasional unfair mark or the general severity, the personal, targeted variety. Harry glanced at Petunia. She was sitting with an expression he'd never quite seen on her before, a compound thing, the usual hostility toward anything magical, but underneath it something he couldn't immediately name. She was listening very carefully. First year, he said. First year, Augusta repeated, and wrote it down. I know that it sounds like a fact, she said. Has it been consistent or escalating? Consistent. He thought about it. Some escalation since fourth year. He's the one teaching occlumency to me this year, he stopped. Which makes it worse, Augusta said, without looking up from the notebook. Because the lessons provide a context in which he has authority and proximity and you have no recourse. Harry stared at her. Yes, he said. Exactly. She wrote something. The burn last week, was that the first physical incident? I don't know if I'd call it, was it the first time one of his actions resulted in direct physical harm to you? Harry thought back through 5 years of potions. The cauldron that had melted in second year, his own fault, but Snape's choice to position him near Neville's unstable potion knowing it would likely go wrong. The time in third year when a spilled shrinking solution had caught the back of his hand and Snape had simply watched him wipe it off. Small things. Accumulated things. No, he said. No, she confirmed, and wrote that down too. Petunia made a small sound. Harry and Augusta both looked at her. She had one hand pressed to her collarbone in a gesture Harry associated with her when she was trying not to say something. Her expression had gone through several iterations since she'd sat down and had arrived somewhere unexpected, somewhere that wasn't outrage or contempt or the brisk indifference that was her default setting with Harry. She looked, Harry thought, faintly ill. Augusta regarded her for a moment. Mrs. Dursley, she said. Your nephew has been a student at Hogwarts for 5 years. In that time, have you received any communication from the school regarding his welfare? Petunia's chin went up. We don't involve ourselves in, that's an answer, Augusta said quietly. The chin came back down. The front door opened. All three of them turned as Vernon Desley shouldered through into the hallway, still in his coat, carrying a shopping bag from Sainsbury's, and then appeared in the sitting-room doorway and stopped. He took in the scene, the strange woman on his settee, the leather notebook, the quill, Harry in the armchair with an expression Vernon had never seen on him before because it was the expression of someone who was not currently trying to be invisible, and turned the color of an old brick. "What's going on?" he said. "Who the devil are you?" "Vernon," Petunia started. "Vernon," Augusta said, and the single use of his first name somehow communicated I know exactly who you are and I am not in any way uncertain about my position relative to yours. My name is Augusta Longbottom. Please come in and sit down." Vernon did not come in and sit down. He held his ground in the doorway, which was his territory, and expanded slightly in the way that large men do when they want to signal that something is their territory. "I don't know who you think you are, coming into my house. I walked through your front door," Augusta said, "when your wife opened it, so you can't reasonably claim I've broken in. I'm a visitor. One who'd appreciate a seat being found, since the alternative is standing in your hallway conducting this conversation where your neighbors might hear it." Vernon's eyes went to Harry. They carried, in that look, a particular instruction: get her out, fix this, make it not happen, and Harry looked back at him and said nothing. He was aware of something happening inside him that felt like a door opening in a house he'd thought was fully mapped, a room he hadn't known was there. He wasn't afraid. He didn't know exactly when in the last 10 minutes that had happened, but it had. "I haven't got time for," Vernon started. "I'll be brief," Augusta said. "I have 3 things to say and then I'll leave and you can return to your day." She waited. Vernon, despite himself, shut up. "The first is this. Harry is a student at my grandson's school. He is also, by law, specifically by the terms of the underage sorcery provisions in the 1963 Wizarding Children's Welfare Act, entitled to certain standards of care from the adults responsible for him during term breaks. Those standards include adequate housing, adequate food, and freedom from conditions that a reasonable person would characterize as harmful." Vernon had gone from brick red to a more complex color. "The second thing," Augusta continued, "is that I have noted the state of this house and the state of Harry and I have formed an opinion. I'm not a ministry official and I'm not here to make formal representations, so you needn't worry about immediate legal consequences from today's visit." She paused, in a way that made very clear that immediate was doing significant work in that sentence. "The third thing is that I intend to maintain an interest in Harry's circumstances going forward. Not from a distance and not through intermediaries. I will write and I will visit and I will be the sort of person who notices things." She looked at Vernon with an expression that was entirely without heat, which was considerably more unnerving than anger would have been. "I would encourage you to consider what you'd like that oversight to reveal." The room was completely silent. Dudley appeared in the hallway behind his father, drawn by the strange quality of the quiet, and looked at the scene with the slow-arriving alarm of someone who has wandered into something and can't immediately identify whether to be afraid. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. Something in Dudley's expression shifted. He'd been different since the Dementors in the alley, not reformed exactly, but altered in some specific and not entirely uninteresting way, like a crack had appeared in something solid and something else was beginning to show through. Dudley went away. Vernon said, thickly, "You don't have any authority over you," Augusta agreed. "Correct. I have no authority over you whatsoever. I'm simply a person who knows your circumstances and intends to remain aware of them." She closed her notebook and capped her quill and tucked them back into the handbag. "As I said. Brief." She stood up. Harry stood up too, almost automatically. Old habit, standing when adults stood. In this house he'd spent years making himself functionally invisible, keeping out of the way, occupying as little space as possible, and it surprised him slightly that what his body wanted to do right now was stand fully upright and take up the space his actual height entitled him to. He was taller than he sometimes remembered. When you spent years trying to be small, you occasionally forgot the actual dimensions of the thing doing the shrinking. Augusta looked at him. "Walk me out," she said. He did. They went through the hallway and out the front door and down the path to the gate, and the winter air hit them, and somewhere 2 streets away a dog was barking. Augusta stood at the gate and looked at him with the direct, undeflected attention she'd maintained throughout the entirety of the last 40 minutes. "I want to ask you one more thing," she said. "Okay. Do you know why I came here today?" He thought about it honestly. "Because Neville told you." "Yes." "And?" "Because he stopped." He started again. "Because you thought someone should." She looked at him for a long moment. Not with the fondness that adults sometimes deployed at him, the specific warmth that was about what he represented rather than who he was, the hero, the symbol, the boy who lived. She looked at him the way you look at a person. "Someone should have done it years ago," she said. "I'm aware of that. I'm not going to dress up the lateness of it as something it isn't." A brief pause. "I am sorry for that, on behalf of the adults who should have been paying attention." Harry opened his mouth and found he couldn't immediately locate a response to that. The sentence had arrived somewhere he hadn't opened the door to, bypassing the defenses entirely because it hadn't come in through the usual channels. It wasn't pity and it wasn't guilt-based and it wasn't asking him to reassure anyone that it was fine. It was simply an apology. Cleanly delivered. No caveat. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked at the gate. "We're going to address the school situation," Augusta said, in a tone that moved on because it understood that some moments needed to be passed through rather than extended. "Snape specifically, and the more general question of who at Hogwarts is responsible for what happens to the students in that school's care. That's not a project for today, but I wanted you to know it's in motion." "Dumbledore," Harry started. "Will be informed," Augusta said, "that I am informed." Which is a different thing to asking his permission. Harry looked at her. "You'll be going back to Hogwarts in a week," she said. "I want you to know, before you go back, that there is at least one person, besides your friends, who are very good, your friends, Neville speaks very well of them, who is paying attention and who is not going to stop." She met his eyes. "Do you understand what I mean by that?" He understood. He understood in a way that was physical before it was intellectual, something tightening in his chest that he'd been ignoring for long enough that he'd stopped registering it until it loosened slightly and the contrast made it visible. "Yes," he said. She gave a brief, decisive nod. She opened the gate and went through it and turned toward the street, and then she stopped and looked back at him. "How are you eating?" she said. The question was so unexpected that he almost laughed. It was exactly the kind of question that shouldn't be the one to break through, the small practical one, after everything else, except that it was also the most honest possible question because it was the one about the daily ordinary reality of being here rather than the large dramatic one about everything else. "Not brilliantly," he said. "No," she said. "I thought not." She reached back into the handbag. Harry was developing a genuine respect for whatever organizational system existed inside it, and produced a paper bag that was warm in a way that suggested it hadn't been packed long ago. "Mrs. Figg's Bakery, 2 streets over. She owed me the address when I wrote to confirm I was coming." Harry took the bag. It was heavy and smelled like pastry and something with cinnamon. "She knew you were coming," he said. "She keeps an eye on you," Augusta said. "She's been keeping an eye on you for years." She's limited in what she can do. Her situation is complicated. But she watches, and this morning she was glad someone else was watching too." She gave him a look that was neither pitying nor sentimental but was, somewhere at the center of it, warm. "Eat something, Harry." She walked away. He stood at the gate and watched her go. She moved with absolute certainty down the pavement, her green cloak at odds with the grey Surrey morning, her hat extraordinary, her pace entirely her own, and she turned the corner at the end of Privet Drive without looking back, and she was gone. Harry stood there for a moment. Then he went back inside. The sitting room was still and Petunia was exactly where she'd been, her hands in her lap, her expression somewhere he hadn't seen it before. Vernon was in the kitchen making a significant amount of noise with the kettle in the way he did when he was agitated but had decided not to act on it, which was a better outcome than Harry had necessarily expected. Petunia looked up when Harry appeared in the doorway. He waited to see what she'd say. He'd been waiting his entire life to see what she'd say, in the moments when the guard came down slightly and the thing underneath showed through, and most of the time what she said was something that closed the gap before anything could come through it. She looked at his jaw. The faded burn mark. She said, "I'll make you a plate." It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement. It was not an explanation of anything or a bridge toward any of the conversations that lived between them, unspoken. In the space between your mother was my sister and I never wanted this and I never knew how. It was just a plate. Harry said, "Okay." She went to the kitchen. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened the paper bag from Mrs. Figg's bakery, and there were 2 sausage rolls and a slice of something with apples in it and a small note in a cramped hand that said only, "Good luck, dear." Petunia put a plate of toast and 2 eggs in front of him without comment and then stood at the counter with her back to him, doing something unnecessarily thorough with the washing up. He ate the toast. He ate one of the sausage rolls. He saved the apple slice. Vernon came in, looked at the scene, registered it as not immediately explosive, and took himself to the sitting room with his newspaper, which was his established method of waiting out difficult situations. The kitchen was quiet except for Petunia at the sink. Harry ate and thought about the notebook and the quill and Augusta Longbottom saying someone should have done it years ago with the steady unflinching honesty of someone who knew the difference between an excuse and a fact and had decided today wasn't a day for excuses. He thought about going back to Hogwarts. He thought about Snape. He thought about the way Snape's voice had dropped in the dungeon, low and private and calibrated perfectly to reach exactly one set of ears, and about the grip slipping, and about the burn, and about saying "I'm fine" again and again until it stopped being a statement and became just a sound his mouth made to fill the space where a different sentence lived. "I'm not fine. I haven't been fine for a long time. I'm 15 and I'm tired and the scar on my forehead hurts and the man who's going to kill me is back and the school is run by someone who won't look at me and I have been burned in class and told it's my fault and I have nowhere to put any of this and I have been telling everyone I'm fine for so long I can't quite remember what the alternative feels like." He ate the apple slice. It was very good. Mrs. Figg, it turned out, had hidden depths. He thought about Augusta walking away down the pavement in her green cloak, and about the certainty in her step, and about the fact that somewhere right now she was getting back in a cab and going home to write in her leather notebook and make whatever plans Augusta Longbottom made when she decided something needed to be done. He thought about Neville. Neville, who had sat 2 seats away and watched and said nothing in the dungeon because there was nothing to say. Neville, who had carried it home on the train. Neville, who had told his Gran. Harry had known Neville for 5 years. He'd always liked him, liked his steadiness, his determination, the way he kept coming back to herbology no matter what else was failing, the quiet unremarked courage of someone who knew their own fear and got up every morning anyway. But he thought now that he hadn't quite understood Neville, hadn't quite registered what Neville had done, was still doing, every time he walked into a space where the expectation was failure and refused to accept the expectation. Today, Neville had looked at Harry and seen him, actually seen him, the full picture, not the chosen one or the school celebrity or the problem to be handled, and had done the only thing available to him. He'd gone home and told the one person he knew who might do something about it. That was, Harry thought, exactly the kind of person you wanted next to you when things went wrong. He finished his breakfast and went upstairs to write a letter. He spent 10 minutes staring at the parchment and then wrote, "Neville. Thank you." He stared at that for another 5 minutes and then added, "She brought food from Mrs. Figg's. Tell her the apple thing was brilliant." He folded it and tied it to Hedwig's leg and she butted her head against his chin once before taking off into the grey December sky. He watched her go. Then he sat down at his desk and picked up the Transfiguration essay and found, for the first time in a week, that the back portion of his mind was quieter than usual. Not silent. Not fixed. But quieter, the way a room is quieter after a window has been opened, not empty, but aired. He began to write. Chapter 3, What the Longbottoms Know About Suffering. The owl arrived on the 30th. Harry was in his room when it came, a large tawny bird he didn't recognize, carrying a letter sealed with dark green wax and the impression of something that looked like a plant with complicated roots. He broke the seal and read it standing up, because he'd been doing his exercises, the stretching routine that Mad Eye had given him in a list the previous summer with the note, "Keep your body operational, Potter, it's the only one you've got." The letter was short. "Harry, I will collect you tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Pack for a week. You'll be staying at Longbottom Manor through the new year. I have spoken with Arabella Figg and she has confirmed the arrangement with the relevant parties. Your trunk will be collected separately. Bring your school things. Augusta Longbottom. P.S. If the Dursleys object, inform them that I have Mrs. Figg's account of the last 5 Christmases in writing. That should resolve any difficulty." Harry read the letter twice. Then he sat on the bed. Then he read it again. He was aware of a number of things simultaneously. One was the sudden and slightly dizzying reality of being someone whose plans had just been made for him by someone else, which was not, in itself, unusual. His plans were frequently made by other people, except that the other times it had been in service of something that required him, not in service of him specifically, not just the straightforward act of "you should not spend the holiday alone in that house, come somewhere else." Another was the P.S., which he read a third time, and the very dry precision of it, the complete absence of apology for having leverage and intending to use it. He packed his trunk that evening. He told the Dursleys at dinner, which was a meal none of them were enjoying since Vernon had been in a complicated mood since the 27th and was expressing it through the volume of his chewing. He said, "Someone's coming to collect me tomorrow morning. I'll be gone through New Year." Petunia looked up. Vernon said nothing, which was different from his usual nothing. It was the nothing of a man who had thought about what he'd been told and had decided, for once, to perform the calculation before responding. "Fine," Vernon said, and reached for the bread. That was all. Harry ate his dinner and went upstairs and finished packing and slept better than he had in 2 weeks, which was not the dramatic thing it might have been in a story but was, in the real texture of his life, significant. Augusta arrived at precisely 9. The same black cab. The same green cloak. Her hat today had a different bird on it, something hawk-adjacent with a sharp expression, and she looked at the trunk Harry had left by the front door with the approval of someone who appreciates punctuality in its various forms. Petunia was in the kitchen doorway. She watched Harry pick up his overnight bag and look back at the house with the complicated expression of a person who doesn't know whether what he feels about leaving a place is relief or something more ambiguous, and she said nothing, and then she said, "Be sensible," which was the closest thing to "take care of yourself" that the available vocabulary permitted. Harry said, "Right," and went out. Augusta was already directing the cab driver on the handling of the trunk with the efficient authority of a field general conducting a supply operation. She glanced at Harry as he came down the path and gave a single nod, a nod that said, "Good, you're here, we're going," and got in the cab. Harry got in beside her. They drove in a particular silence for a few minutes, the kind that isn't uncomfortable but is simply the silence of two people who don't yet know the other's rhythm. Then Augusta said, "Did you sleep? Better than usual. Good." She looked out the window at the retreating geometry of Privet Drive, the identical houses, the carefully maintained hedges, the absolute commitment to sameness. Her expression was thoughtful in the way of someone filing information rather than judging it. "We'll go directly. It's roughly 2 hours by Muggle transport to the outskirts of Dorset, and then we'll switch." "Switch? You'll see." She opened her handbag and produced a small paper bag. "Breakfast. I didn't assume you'd eaten." He hadn't. He took the bag. Inside was a warm pastry and 2 pieces of fruit and a small card that said Longbottom Manor, New Year, one guest in Neville's handwriting, which had not improved since first year. "He made the card," Harry said. "He was very pleased about it," Augusta said, looking out the window. "He spent 20 minutes on it. I didn't mention that the lettering was uneven. Harry ate the pastry. They drove through the grey morning and Augusta read a small leather-bound book and Harry watched the city give way to suburb and suburb give way to the motorway and the motorway give way eventually to the kind of landscape that England hid behind its industrial edges, the hills coming up green and complicated, the sky wider, the trees bare but present in a way that registered. Outside a village in Dorset that Harry didn't catch the name of, Augusta told the driver to stop at a levee and paid him and they stood on the verge while the cab reversed and drove away. Augusta reached into the handbag. She produced a small bronze key on a chain. "Port key," she said. "Ready yourself." Harry touched the key. Longbottom Manor arrived around them the way port key travel always arrived, the horrible lurch, the sense of the world reorganizing itself without asking, and then the ground was solid underfoot and Harry straightened up and looked. The house was old. Not in the crumbling Gothic way of places that traded on age as atmosphere, but in the way that spoke of genuine time, stone walls that had absorbed centuries, a roof that had been repaired and re-repaired and whose variations told a history, a garden that had been tended for so long it had developed opinions about how it wanted to be. It was large without being ostentatious, which was a trick of architecture that Harry had rarely encountered. The windows had the uneven quality of very old glass and the front door was enormous and dark and had been opened so many times it sat on its hinges with the ease of something that expected to be used. Neville was on the front steps. He looked different here. That was the first thing Harry noticed. At school Neville occupied space with a kind of provisional quality, as though he were never quite certain he was meant to be where he was. Here he stood on the steps of his own house with the quiet groundedness of someone standing on something they knew to be solid. He was in an old jumper and jeans and his face had the open slightly worried look it always had, except underneath the worry was something else, something that was paying careful attention to Harry's face to see how he was taking this. "Hi," Harry said. "Hi," Neville said. Is the pastry good?" "She got the pastry from, it was brilliant," Harry said. "The one from Mrs. Figg's too." Neville's face did something complicated and relieved. "Right. Good." He came down the steps. "Your room's the east one, it's got better light. Gran put the herbology books in there because she thought you might. Well, I told her you didn't really do herbology outside class but she thought the natural light was better for sleeping so, Neville," Harry said. "Right. Thank you." Neville stopped on the bottom step and looked at him. The word had been quiet and direct and neither of them was quite sure what to do with the weight of it, not because it was embarrassing but because it was the kind of thanks that came from somewhere real, and genuine things sometimes require a moment before you can respond to them. "You'd have done the same," Neville said. Harry thought about that. About whether he'd have known to do the same, whether, watching from 2 seats away, he'd have had the presence of mind to carry it home and put it in front of someone who could act on it. He honestly wasn't sure. He thought he might have absorbed it as one more thing to absorb. He thought Neville's version was braver. "Maybe," he said. Augusta came up the path behind them and said, "Inside, please, it's 4 degrees, and they went in. The inside of Longbottom Manor was warm in the specific way of houses that have been heated by magic for centuries, a deep even warmth that sat in the walls and the floors rather than emanating from any specific source. The hallway was wide and flagged with stone and hung with the kind of portraits that were aware of you and interested in you, which Harry was used to, but here the portraits had the comfortable familiarity of family photographs, people he didn't know but who looked out of their frames with the expression of people in houses they belonged to. He followed Neville up to the east bedroom, which was bright even in December and had a window seat and a large bed with a complicated quilt and a small bookshelf that did, in fact, have several volumes of advanced herbology that Harry had no interest in but which looked reassuring on the shelf in the same way books always looked reassuring on shelves regardless of content. His trunk arrived 20 minutes later via a small pop that announced the house elf, a wizened individual named Mopsy who regarded Harry with enormous eyes and said, "Master Potter's trunk, yes, Mopsy has brought it, Mopsy hopes Master Potter is comfortable," and departed before Harry could say anything except, "Thank you," which Mopsy received with an expression of pleasant surprise. He stood at the window and looked out at the winter garden, wide, complicated, the kind of garden that clearly had a serious practitioner behind it, and thought, this is a real house. Not in the way Privet Drive was a real house, which was the house of people maintaining the appearance of a life. A house where things had happened and been remembered and the walls held them, where the garden was what it was because someone loved it, where the warmth wasn't performed. Neville knocked and came in with 2 mugs of tea and sat on the window seat with the ease of someone for whom the window seat of this room was a familiar object. She's going to want to talk to you properly tonight, Neville said. About Snape. The whole thing. She's been writing. I figured, Harry said. She had a notebook. She always has a notebook. Neville wrapped his hands around his mug. She keeps records about everything. After my mum and dad, she kept records of everything that was done and not done, every person who should have been held accountable and wasn't. She doesn't let things go, Gran. Once she's decided something needs addressing, she addresses it. He looked at his tea. She can be a lot. I know she can be a lot. She's brilliant, Harry said plainly. Neville looked up. I mean it. She walked into my aunt's sitting room and sat down and nobody knew how to stop her. My uncle's the size of a walrus and he just sat down because she told him to. Neville made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated. She does that. A pause. She's always been like that with everyone except me. Harry looked at him. With me she expected things, Neville said. She had this whole picture of what I was supposed to be. My father's son, right, Frank Longbottom's boy, and Frank he was good at everything, apparently. Magic came easily to him. He was confident. Everyone liked him. Gran doesn't say it directly but she's been comparing me to that picture for as long as I can remember. He turned the mug in his hands. I know she loves me. I do know that. But sometimes I think she looks at me and sees the distance between me and that picture. Harry was quiet for a moment. What does she see when she looks at you now? After you told her. Neville didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the garden, at the frost on the bare soil, at the structured beds that were sleeping through winter into something better. Something different, he said slowly. She looked at me at dinner after I told her and she had this, I don't know how to describe it. Like she was revising something. Like she'd been reading a book one way and suddenly she understood a thing in it differently and she had to go back to the beginning. Harry thought about the way Augusta had looked at him at the gate of Privet Drive. The way she'd said someone should have done it years ago and not softened the admission. The way she paid attention, not to the version of the person she expected to see, but to the actual thing in front of her. She sees you, Harry said. I think that's new. Neville was quiet. Then he said, yeah, and drank his tea. They spent the afternoon in the greenhouse. It was Neville's greenhouse, a long glass structure at the back of the formal garden, warm and humid and smelling of earth and green things and something faintly alkaline that Harry couldn't identify and Neville could name 6 varieties of without trying. It was, Harry realized within about 10 minutes, the place where Neville was most fully himself. Not the Neville of the corridors or the common room or the potions dungeon, the one who braced himself against expectations and the ever-present possibility of getting things wrong, but a Neville who moved with absolute assurance, who knew exactly where everything was and why, who spoke about plants with the fluency and affection most people reserved for subjects they'd chosen rather than been assigned. This one, Neville said, stopping at a pot in the corner where a plant that looked like an unremarkable fern sat in dark compost, took 3 years to get this far. Snargaluff sapling. They're almost impossible in captivity because they're semi-sentient and they decide whether they like you. This one decided it liked me in 2nd year. I don't fully understand why. You probably just seem non-threatening, Harry said. Thanks. I meant it as a compliment. Neville considered this. The Mimbulus Mimbletonia is doing well, he said, moving to a different shelf where a cactus-like thing sat in a pot that was too small for it, judging by the way it was very gently pushing against the rim. I'll repot it in spring. I think it's attached to this one though, so I'll have to do it in stages. He touched the pot's edge and the plant made a small movement that was either coincidental or responsive. They like consistency. Harry sat on an upturned pot and watched Neville work and thought, not for the first time, that it must be extraordinary to know what you loved. To have a thing that was yours in that way, not because someone needed you to have it or because it made you useful in some larger plan, but simply because it was where you made sense. Do you like defense? Neville asked, not looking up from a leaf he was examining for something Harry couldn't identify. Yeah, Harry said. Real defense. Not Umbridge's version. What's the difference to you? Harry thought about it. Real defense it's about being able to handle things. Being prepared. Umbridge's is about passing a test on handling things, which is completely different. He paused. Real defense saved my life. Several times. Umbridge's defense would have gotten me killed. Neville set down his leaf. The DA, he said. You should start it earlier this year. After we get back. Harry looked at him. I mean it, Neville said. Don't wait for a crisis. Start it in the first week. He said it with a quiet directness that Harry hadn't heard from him in quite that register before. We know what's coming. We've known since the graveyard. Start preparing. You're different here, Harry said. Neville blinked. What? Here. At home. I don't know. Clearer. Neville seemed to think about this. I suppose I am, he said. At school there's so much noise about what I'm supposed to be. Gran's expectations and Snape's, he stopped and his jaw tightened slightly. Snape's thing about me not belonging there. And I carry all of it, you know. You can't help it, you carry what people tell you about yourself. He picked up a small trowel and turned it in his hands. But here I know what I can do. I've been building this greenhouse since I was 9. I know this. He gestured at the green, humid, growing space around him. And I know that the person who built this is not the person Snape describes. Those two things can't both be true. Harry was quiet. The problem, Neville said, is believing it away from the greenhouse. Yeah, Harry said. I know that problem. Augusta joined them at dinner, and dinner at Longbottom Manor was not the performance that dinner had been in the Dursley house. It was simply food, good food, served without ceremony, and it tasted like the kind of cooking that was done for pleasure in someone else's pleasure as much as your own. Mopsy had made something with root vegetables and pastry and a soup that Harry had 2 bowls of before he registered what he was doing. Augusta watched him eat with satisfaction and said nothing about it, which was the correct response. After dinner they moved to the sitting room, which had a fire and comfortable chairs that had the settled look of furniture that had been sat in for decades, and Augusta opened her notebook on the side table and looked at Harry. I've been doing some reading, she said. Since our visit. How much reading? Harry said. The relevant sections of the Educational Authority provisions. The Hogwarts Charter. The specific bylaws governing staff conduct. The Wisengamot procedural rules for a formal complaint against a ministry-affiliated institution. She paused. Quite a lot of reading. Harry leaned forward slightly. You're going to make a formal complaint. I'm going to make an evidence-based case, she said. Which is not quite the same thing. A formal complaint can be dismissed, appealed, filed away. An evidence-based case with a public record and the right witnesses is considerably more difficult to manage quietly. She looked at him steadily. That distinction matters because Dumbledore is going to attempt to manage this quietly. He always does. You don't trust Dumbledore, Harry said. I trust that Dumbledore is a brilliant man with genuine commitment to the defeat of Voldemort, she said, without pausing on the name in the way most people paused on it. I also trust that his commitment to that defeat can lead him to make decisions about individuals that he would not characterize as callous but which are, in their practical effect, exactly that. The two things coexist. She folded her hands on the notebook. I am not his enemy. But I am not his collaborator, either. Harry thought about this. About the year of averted eyes and closed doors and the feeling of being kept deliberately in the dark, of being a piece on a board rather than a person making decisions. About the fact that Dumbledore's care for him was real, he knew it was real, could feel it in the specific way that Dumbledore noticed things about him, the warmth underneath the distance, and that real care and harmful decisions were not mutually exclusive, which was something he'd been trying to understand for a year and hadn't had language for until this moment. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "A written account," she said. "Your specific experiences with Snape. Dated where possible, described accurately, without dramatization and without minimization. Both are equally useless in a formal context. Just what happened, what was said, and the effect it had." She held out a fresh piece of parchment. "Can you do that? Now? If you're willing." He picked up the parchment. He started writing. It was harder than he expected. Not because the memories weren't there, they were all there, sharp and specific, stored in the particular way you stored things that had happened to your body, but because writing them down meant looking at them in a way that he usually managed to avoid. When you were inside something it moved with you, you adjusted to it, it became the texture of the environment rather than a specific sequence of events you had to name one by one. Writing it down made it a sequence of events. September 1991. Professor Snape asked me about bezoars in my first lesson. When I answered, he said, he wrote for an hour. Augusta sat by the fire and read her book and didn't look over his shoulder, didn't offer commentary, let him work. Neville sat across from him with his own work, a herbology practical report, covered in neat diagrams, and occasionally they were aware of each other in the comfortable way of people sharing a space. At one point Neville looked up and said, "There was the time in third year. Shrinking solution. Your hand." Harry hadn't written that one yet. He wrote it. When he'd finished, the parchment was dense on both sides and he set down the quill and felt slightly hollowed out in the specific way that honest accounting takes something from you. Not bad exactly. Just lighter than he'd expected, the way you feel after a long run, the kind of physical depletion that has a different quality to the emotional kind. He handed it to Augusta. She read it without a word. Her expression didn't change, not noticeably, but her jaw was tight by the third paragraph and her hand on the edge of the parchment was very still. She read to the end. "Thank you," she said. She set it on the notebook and smoothed the edge. "This is thorough. This is good." She looked at him. "I want to tell you something, Harry, and I want you to hear it plainly." He waited. "None of this was normal," she said. "I'm aware that you know that, on one level. But I think there's another level at which you've absorbed it as the texture of your life, as simply the way things were, and so knowing it abstractly and feeling it as true are different things." She was direct and clear and utterly without sentimentality. A teacher who speaks to a student the way Snape has spoken to you should have been removed from his position in your first year. What has continued for 5 years is a failure of the institution and of the people responsible for running it. That failure is not yours to carry. Harry's throat was unexpectedly tight. He said nothing. He nodded once, because it was the most he could manage. Neville was looking at the fire. Augusta let the moment be what it was without rushing it, which was a skill, sitting with something difficult without filling the silence with reassurance or deflection. Then she said, "Right," and closed the notebook and poured 3 cups of tea from the pot that had been quietly developing on the table. "Frank always had 3 sugars," she said, apropos of nothing, and then stopped. "My dad?" Neville said. "Yes." She handed him his cup. "It drove me absolutely mad. I told him it would rot his teeth." She paused. "His teeth were fine." It was such a small and specific piece of information, such a clear and unguarded glimpse of a different version of Augusta, the one who had a son whose teeth were fine and whose presence in her life was so complete she could tell you about his tea preferences without checking her memory, that both Harry and Neville were momentarily very still. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said. Augusta looked at him. "Frank and Alice. Would you tell me about them? He felt the slight awkwardness of asking, the way the question required him to step into territory that belonged to someone else's grief. Not about what happened. Just, who they were. Augusta was quiet for a moment. Outside the wind moved through the winter garden and the fire shifted. Frank, she said slowly, was stubborn in the exact way his father was stubborn, which is to say completely and without any awareness of it whatsoever. He believed everything was solvable if you were willing to work long enough, which was occasionally the most infuriating quality and occasionally the most useful one, depending on what needed solving. She turned her teacup once. He was kind in the way that isn't performed. Some people are kind as a social mechanism, they understand that warmth is strategically effective. Frank wasn't like that. He was simply kind because people were in front of him and people mattered. It was that uncomplicated. She paused. Alice was the one with the strategy. Between the two of them, you had everything, really. Frank was the heart of it and Alice was the architecture. Neville was very still and very focused. She would have been extraordinary, Augusta said, and her voice had something in it that she controlled very precisely, held at exactly the level where feeling was audible but not overwhelming, where it was the truth and not the performance of it. She was extraordinary. In a different world she stopped. Well. She picked up her teacup. The world we have is the one we navigate. Harry thought about his own parents. About the photographs he had, the stories Lupin had told him, serious as versions of James that were soaked in love and humor and loss. About standing in Godric's Hollow in his imagination, he'd never been, but he'd imagined it many times, and the specific kind of grief that was for people you'd never known, which had a different quality to it, not less but different, more abstract and more permanent. Would you take me to see them? He asked. Tomorrow. If you think that's appropriate. Augusta looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but something that had to reorganize itself slightly. Neville's head turned toward Harry. I visit on the 1st of every month, Augusta said. Tomorrow is the 31st. She looked at the fire for a moment. I don't usually take anyone. But I think, she stopped. Yes, she said. I think that would be appropriate. Harry nodded. Later, when they'd said goodnight and he was in the east bedroom with its comfortable bed and the strange good smell of a house that had always been a house, he lay in the dark and thought about Neville in the greenhouse. The person who built this is not the person Snape describes, and about the parchment with 5 years of incidents written in his own hand, and about Augusta's voice saying that failure is not yours to carry. He thought about what was coming. About the letter Augusta was going to write to Dumbledore. About the Wizengamot. About Snape's face when he realized someone had been keeping records. He thought about the DA and Neville's voice in the greenhouse saying started in the first week, don't wait for a crisis. He thought about the fact that outside this window there was a garden that Neville had been building since he was 9, and it was winter now and bare, but underneath the frost the roots of things went very deep. He slept without dreaming. For the first time in months he slept without dreaming, and when he woke to the winter light coming through the old glass of the east bedroom window he lay there for a moment in the warmth of a house that was someone's home and felt the quality of the quiet, and it was good. Chapter 4, The Owl to Dumbledore. The 1st of January arrived cold and clear, the sky the sharp particular blue that only happens in winter when the air has been scoured clean of everything soft. Frost on the garden. Frost on the greenhouse glass. Frost on the stone steps where Neville had left his boots the night before, which Augusta noticed and did not comment on, which was itself a kind of comment. They went to St. Mungo's at 10. Augusta wore her best traveling cloak, darker than the green one, almost black, with a silver clasp, and she walked into the hospital with the composed precision of someone who had made this journey so many times it had become a form of ritual, which it had. Every 1st of the month for going on 14 years. She knew the healers by name and they knew her, and the ones who had been there long enough knew better than to offer her anything that looked like pity. Harry had been to St. Mungo's once, the previous year, in the rushed confusion of Mr. Weasley's emergency, and he remembered it as loud and bright and chaotic. The long-term ward was different. It was on the 4th floor and it was quieter in a way that was not peaceful exactly but was deliberate, a quiet maintained by care, by the soft spells that kept the air clean and the sounds gentle, by the particular attentiveness of the healers who worked there, who had chosen the ward that didn't have recoveries. Neville walked beside his grandmother with his shoulders set. Not tense, resolved. The way you carry something you've been carrying for years and have found the balance for. He glanced at Harry once as they stepped off the moving staircase and Harry looked back at him and Neville gave a small nod. It's all right. You can be here. Room 49 was at the end of the corridor. Augusta opened the door. The room had 2 beds and 2 chairs between them and a window that looked out over the London rooftops, frost-edged and silver. Both beds were occupied. The man in the left bed had a broad face and sandy hair going grey at the temples and the kind of hands that looked like they'd been built for physical work, large-knuckled, capable, lying loose on the coverlet. His eyes were open and tracking the window with the slow unfocused movement of eyes that saw something but not the room. The woman in the right bed was smaller and had Neville's coloring, warm brown and faintly freckled, and she was sitting up with a kind of concentrated attention on the piece of parchment she held in both hands, turning it over and over in a way that had nothing to do with reading it. Neville went to his mother's side. He sat in the chair and said, "Hello, Mom," in the quiet even tone of someone who has made peace with the fact that the response will not be what he wants and sits down anyway. Alice Longbottom looked up when she heard his voice and her face changed slightly, something moved across it, something that lived in the region of recognition without quite becoming it, the way light moves under the surface of deep water. She held out the wrapper from a piece of bubblegum. Neville took it. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket and said, "Thank you," and meant it. Augusta was at Frank's bedside, her hand over his, talking to him in a low voice that Harry couldn't hear and wasn't meant to. She talked to Frank every visit. Harry had learned this from Neville on the walk over, along with "She doesn't tell anyone what she says, she's never told me, I've never asked," and whatever she said was hers, private, the ongoing conversation of a woman who had refused to accept that just because a conversation becomes one-sided it stops being a conversation. Harry stood just inside the door. He stood there and looked at the room, at Neville folding the wrapper, at Augusta's hand over Frank's, at the winter light from the window, and felt the weight of it, not as something imposed on him but as something he was choosing to hold, the way you sometimes choose to look directly at a difficult thing because looking away from it is its own kind of cost. He thought about his parents. He thought about Godric's Hollow, which was a grave rather than a room, a headstone rather than a bed, which was in some ways more final and in some ways less, because here at least, here Augusta could hold Frank's hand and tell him things and Neville could pocket the wrapper and say thank you and mean it, and the absence wasn't an absence, it was a presence of a different and painful kind. He thought about Voldemort. Not with the fear that had been his default relation to the thought since the graveyard, not with the cold pulse of the scar and the invading dreams, but with something cleaner and harder. He thought about the man whose choices had produced this room, these beds, these 2 families suspended between loss and the ongoing present, and the clean hard thing inside him settled. This is why, he thought. Not prophecy. Not destiny. Not because a mark on his forehead had written a story with him in it. This room. This reason. After 20 minutes Augusta stood and adjusted the blanket on Frank's bed with precise care, corner to corner, and turned. She saw Harry's face. She didn't say anything. But she looked at him the way she'd looked at him at the gate of Privet Drive, without filtering the person she expected through the person in front of her, and then she nodded, once, and went to stand beside Neville. They left at 11. Walking back through the corridor, Neville fell into step beside Harry and they were quiet for a moment. "She brings him things," Neville said. "Every month. Little things, newspaper clippings she thinks he'd find interesting. A leaf from the garden. She folds them up and puts them in the drawer of his bedside table. He stopped. She's never stopped talking to him. 14 years. Harry thought about the kind of love that endures without return. The kind that doesn't need an answer to keep going. He thought about what it must take to be that kind of person, to not calcify around that much grief, to keep it moving and present rather than hardening it into something that protects you by shutting you off. He thought Augusta had come very close to that, to letting the grief become armor instead of fuel. He thought Neville had been, for many years, the collateral damage of that almost. And then Neville had told her something true and she'd heard it, and something had reopened. "She's remarkable," Harry said. "She's a lot," Neville said, and then, "Yeah. She is." The letter was written that afternoon. Harry knew it was happening because Augusta disappeared into the study after lunch and the study door closed, which was a sound that had a specific weight in Longbottom Manor, not a forbidden sound, but a serious one, a sound that said the thing being done in this room requires the room to itself. He and Neville played Exploding Snap in the sitting room and listened to the occasional silence and the occasional burst of writing that came through the door as a scratching they could just make out. It took 3 hours. When Augusta emerged, she had 4 sheets of parchment covered in close writing, which she read through standing at the hallway table with the expression of someone making a final check on something load-bearing. She made 2 small corrections, blotted the ink, and folded the sheets with precise corners. She sealed it with the green wax and the Longbottom device. She looked up and found both Harry and Neville in the doorway of the sitting room. "I'm not going to read it to you," she said, which was not what either of them had been going to ask but was clearly what she'd expected. "What I will tell you is what it contains." She set the letter on the table. First, a formal record of Harry's account of 5 years of conduct by Severus Snape, including specific incidents with dates, the nature of the conduct, and the effect on the student. Second, a notification that I intend to bring this record before a Wisengamot Education Subcommittee, and that I would prefer to do so after a conversation with him, but I will do so regardless of whether the conversation occurs. Third, she paused, briefly. Third, a direct statement about Harry's living circumstances and the absence of any welfare oversight during his time at Hogwarts. This third section is not an accusation. It is a statement of documented fact with a request for explanation. Harry said, "And if he manages it quietly?" Augusta looked at him. "He can't. I've sent copies." Neville's eyebrows went up. "To who?" "To Madame Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. To Griselda Marchbanks of the Wisengamot. And to 3 members of the Hogwarts Board of Governors who I know personally and who are not aligned with Lucius Malfoy's faction." She said this with perfect equanimity. "Albus will receive his letter and know before he finishes reading it that the information is already in 5 sets of hands. Managing it quietly will not be an option he can choose." Harry was quiet for a moment. He said, "He's going to be angry." "He will be many things," Augusta said. "Angry is probably not the primary one. Albus Dumbledore does not operate from anger as a first response, he operates from calculation. His primary response will be to assess the situation, determine what damage has been done and to what, and develop a strategy for managing the fallout." She picked up the letter. "My purpose in sending copies first is to ensure that his strategy cannot include simply explaining to me, privately and very persuasively, why what I've done is premature and should be entrusted to his handling." "Because he could," Harry said. "Persuade you?" "He could try," she said. "I am not immune to Albus Dumbledore's considerable gifts. But he can only try to persuade me, he cannot persuade Madame Bones or Marchbanks, because they already have the information." She called for Mopsy and the letters were dispatched. 4 identical tawny owls lifted from the upstairs window and banked south toward London and north toward Scotland, and Harry stood in the garden in the cold afternoon air and watched them go until they were specks against the winter blue and then nothing. Neville stood beside him. "How are you feeling?" Neville asked. "Honest answer. Please." "Like something's been set in motion that I can't stop," Harry said. "Which is, good. That's what I want. He tried to find the rest of it. I've been in situations before where things were happening for me. Like, Dumbledore's chess game, sort of. Where things were arranged and I was a piece that needed to be in a certain position. This feels different because it's for me. Not me as the piece. Me as the person. He paused. I keep waiting to find out what the catch is. Neville was quiet for a moment. Maybe there isn't one this time. There's always, or maybe, Neville said, steady, you're just not used to someone doing something straightforwardly because it's the right thing. So your brain keeps looking for the hidden requirement. He looked at Harry sidelong. She didn't come to Privet Drive because she needs something from you, Harry. She came because I told her you were getting burned in class and no one was doing anything about it. Harry said nothing. Sometimes that's actually all there is to it, Neville said. Dumbledore arrived the following morning. This was faster than anyone had anticipated, which meant the copies had arrived and he'd read all of them the previous afternoon and had apparat to the edge of the Longbottom wards as early as was socially tolerable on the 2nd of January. Harry and Neville were in the greenhouse when Mopsy appeared between the squash runners and said, Professor Dumbledore is at the gate. Madame Longbottom says would the young masters please come inside, in a tone that communicated both the request and the view that young masters was performing some heavy lifting. They went inside. Augusta was in the sitting room standing at the window, and she turned when they came in and looked at them both with the assessment she'd been giving Neville his whole life but which now included Harry as a matter of course. Sit down, she said. I'm going to see him in here. You're both entitled to be present for this conversation. If either of you speaks, speak plainly, don't manage him, don't soften things, don't accept a framing that isn't accurate. She looked at Harry specifically. He's very good at reframing. He can take a thing that happened and describe it in terms that make you feel the real problem is your response to it rather than the thing itself. Notice when he's doing that. Harry said, I know. She looked at him, and something in her expression was both sharp and warm simultaneously. Yes, she said. I rather think you do. She went to the door. Dumbledore entered Longbottom Manor the way he entered everything, with the particular quality of a person for whom any space was comfortable, who never needed to take a moment to orient himself, who arrived already at home. His robes were blue today, quieter than his usual, which Harry registered as deliberate. The half-moon glasses and the long white hair and the beard were familiar enough to be almost disorienting here, outside the context of Hogwarts, like seeing a building you know well from a different angle and finding it slightly unrecognizable. His eyes went to Harry immediately. There was something in them, not guilt, Dumbledore didn't traffic in guilt, but something adjacent, a recognition of complexity, the look of a man who has been given information that has confirmed a thing he had been successfully not confirming. Harry, he said, and his voice had its usual warmth and Harry noticed, for the first time with complete clarity, the way the warmth functioned, genuinely felt and simultaneously deployed, the way a tool can be genuine and strategic at once. Professor, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him for another moment, just a moment, and then turned to Augusta. Augusta. Thank you for seeing me. I sent you a letter, Augusta said, sitting down. You're here because you read it. We can dispense with the social pleasantries if you don't mind. Dumbledore sat in the chair across from her with the expression of a man making a decision about his approach. I read it, he confirmed. All 4 copies. Good. She folded her hands. Then you know what I intend and you know I've given you the courtesy of this conversation before I proceed. What would you like to say? A pause. Dumbledore looked at his hands. I would like to say that the incidents Harry has described are troubling. Deeply so. I want to be clear that I do not minimize them. But, Augusta said. Dumbledore looked up. Something that might have been amusement, had the situation been different, moved across his face. You anticipate me. I've known you for 60 years, Albus. Everything you say that isn't a but is preliminary to the but. Please get to it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the situation at Hogwarts is considerably more complicated than a complaint to the Wisengamot Education Subcommittee can resolve without causing damage that extends beyond the school. Define the damage, Augusta said. Severus Snape is a crucial asset in the work of the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore said, and his voice was level and honest in a way that Harry recognized as the version of Dumbledore that was the most itself, not managing, not performing, simply stating a truth he'd been carrying for a long time. His position at Hogwarts provides his cover. His access provides intelligence. A formal proceeding against him would compromise his cover, Augusta finished. Yes. I anticipated that argument too. She looked at Dumbledore with the clear steady look she'd given Vernon Dursley and Harry and the hospital room and everything else that required seeing directly. The argument is that Harry Potter should continue to be subjected to a pattern of targeted abuse because the abuser is useful in a wider context. That is the argument, Augusta said. I understand it doesn't look that way from inside the calculation. But strip away the context and look at what you're asking for, Albus. You are asking a child to absorb harm so that an adult can maintain a useful position. That is the thing itself. Dumbledore was very still. Harry was watching him. He'd been watching him since he'd walked in, looking for the thing that Dumbledore kept private, the actual interior of the man beneath the management. He saw it now, briefly. Saw the cost the thing cost him. Not indifference, the opposite, a pain that was real and that was constantly being weighed against other things that were also real, and the weighing had, for years, come out wrong. I don't disagree, Dumbledore said quietly, with the core of what you've said. Augusta waited. I have failed, Dumbledore said, to intervene in situations where intervention was required, because I was balancing competing necessities. I recognize that the balancing, in Harry's case, has consistently resolved in a direction that has not served him. He looked at Harry, directly, without the careful avoidance that had characterized their whole last term. I owe you an apology for that, Harry. Not the kind that asks you to understand the complexity, the straightforward kind. The room was very quiet. Neville was still as a held breath beside Harry on the settee. Harry looked at Dumbledore and felt all the things he'd been feeling for a year, the anger, the confusion, the specific grief of being managed by someone he trusted, and said, steadily, I hear you. He paused. But she's still going to the Wizengamot. Dumbledore turned to Augusta. Augusta met his eyes. Yes, she said. I am. Because an apology to Harry, however genuine, does not constitute a structural change. And the next student, not necessarily Harry, the next child who sits in that dungeon and says the wrong thing at the wrong moment and has their confidence systematically taken apart, does not benefit from a private apology made in my sitting room on the 2nd of January. Dumbledore studied her for a long moment. You are asking me to agree to a proceeding that will require me to publicly acknowledge failures of oversight in my own school, he said. I'm not asking you to agree, Augusta said. I'm informing you of what's happening. Your agreement is not a prerequisite. And if I obstruct it? Augusta's expression didn't change. I have the account of a student. I have a medical record from the school hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey has been treating Harry for potion burns since second year, and Madame Pomfrey, when asked directly by someone with the standing to ask, will not lie. I have Neville's witness account. I have the procedural record of the Hogwarts Education Authority, which shows 0 formal complaints upheld against any staff member in 30 years, which is not a record of excellence but a record of complaints not being heard. She paused. I can make this case, Albus, with or without your cooperation. With your cooperation it is a case for reform. Without it, it becomes a case about a pattern of institutional concealment. The fire shifted. Dumbledore took off his glasses and held them for a moment. It was, Harry realized, the gesture he used when he wasn't performing anything, when he was simply a very old man holding a problem up to the light and looking at it honestly. What do you want from me? He said. 3 things, Augusta said. First, you publicly acknowledge, before the subcommittee, that welfare oversight at Hogwarts has been insufficient and that you are committed to reform. Second, Snape's teaching conduct is reviewed, formally, and if he is to remain on staff, which I understand may be a necessity, the review constitutes a documented condition of that continuation. Third, she glanced at Harry. Harry is given information. Not managed, not protected from complexity. Given actual information about his situation, what it requires, and what is being done about it. He is 15 years old and the central figure in a war. He deserves to know what that means. Dumbledore put his glasses back on. He looked at Harry. Harry met his eyes and didn't look away. I had reasons, Dumbledore said, for not telling you things, Harry. Some of those reasons were about protection, some of them were about control, Harry said, and the word was quiet and accurate and landed without cruelty. You thought if I knew everything I'd do something you couldn't predict. And unpredictable people are harder to use as pieces. Dumbledore absorbed this. That is, he stopped. That is more accurate than I would like to admit. I know you care about me, Harry said. I've always known that. He found the words he'd been trying to find since September, since a year of averted gazes and closed doors. I need you to trust that caring about me and trusting me are not the same thing, and that you can't actually do the first one properly without the second. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, the winter garden stood in its frost and the bare trees were very still. Dumbledore said, "You are 15 years old," with something in his voice that was wonder and sorrow in approximately equal parts. Yeah, Harry said. I've been 15 years old the whole time. They listened through the door. This was technically not accurate, they were sitting in the sitting room, having been asked to wait in the garden while Augusta and Dumbledore had a portion of the conversation that was about order business and therefore not for Harry, but the door between the sitting room and the study was old and the gap at the bottom was considerable and neither of them was making any effort to not hear. Augusta's voice, low, steady, the register she used when she was making points she had made already and was making again for clarity rather than repetition. Dumbledore's voice, less certain than usual, the texture of a man revising. She's winning, Neville said quietly. She's not arguing, Harry said. She's just right, and she keeps being right, and eventually there's nothing left to push against. Neville considered this. That's what winning looks like, when you're her. Through the door, Dumbledore's voice, the boy needs to understand what he faces, Augusta, then tell him. Stop making decisions about what he can bear to know and simply tell him. A pause. Dumbledore, it is not simple, Augusta. Augusta, no. But it is required. Neville looked at Harry. You're going to get the actual conversation. With Dumbledore. The real one. Aren't you? Sounds like it, Harry said. How does that feel? Harry thought about it honestly. Terrifying, he said. And, good. Both at once. Neville nodded. That's usually what important things feel like. The door opened. Both of them looked up with an expression that made very clear they had been entirely present in the hallway. Augusta took one look at them and said nothing, which was its own variety of commentary. Dumbledore came through behind her and stopped when he saw Harry. I would like to speak with you, he said. Before I leave. Privately, if you're willing. Harry looked at Augusta. She gave him the nod that meant this is your call, no obligation attached, which was a new addition to the vocabulary they were building, him and her, the shorthand of two people finding their respective positions in a relationship that was only a week old and already felt like something structural. All right, Harry said. They went to the kitchen, which was neutral ground, and sat at the table across from each other, and Dumbledore folded his hands and said, What do you want to know? Harry looked at him. Then he started asking. He asked about the prophecy. Dumbledore told him, not the full content, not yet, but the shape of it, enough to stop it being a thing Harry could feel around the edges of without seeing. He asked about Voldemort's return and what was known about his current movements and Dumbledore told him that too, more than he'd been told in a year of silence. He asked about the protection on Privet Drive and why it required suffering to be considered adequate and Dumbledore paused and said, It requires you to have a home there. I conflated home with safety and I was wrong, which was not a complete answer but was more honest than Harry had expected. Harry asked about Snape. Dumbledore said, "He is one of the bravest men I know." Harry said, "That doesn't answer my question." "No," Dumbledore agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at Harry. "Severus is, the grief he carries has not been well directed. His regard for your mother, and his relationship with your father, have produced a pattern of behavior toward you that I have allowed to continue for too long because his other contributions seem to outweigh the cost." He paused. "Mrs. Longbottom has made it very clear to me that this accounting was flawed." "The cost was paid by me," Harry said. "Yes. Simply. Without qualification. It was. And that was wrong." Harry sat with this. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel the particular satisfaction he might have imagined in this conversation, the apology, the admission, the formal acknowledgement of 5 years of accumulated damage. What he felt was something more complicated, a kind of release that was also a kind of grief, the way doors opening sometimes let cold air in. "I need you to actually trust me going forward," Harry said. "Not just tell me you do." "I know." Dumbledore met his eyes and there was nothing averted in them today, nothing carefully angled away. "I intend to." "And Snape," Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet. "The occlumency lessons," Harry said. "Are they actually necessary?" "The skill is necessary," Dumbledore said. "Whether Snape is the right teacher for it is, a question I should have asked before I arranged it." He paused. "Is there someone you would prefer?" Harry thought about it. "Teach me yourself," he said. Not asking, stating. Testing the reality of the conversation, whether it was a new kind of conversation or the old kind dressed differently. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "All right." Harry exhaled. He hadn't known he'd been holding it. Outside in the garden, through the kitchen window, the frost was beginning to soften in the midday sun, the rigid outlines of the bare beds going softer at the edges, the first suggestion of water where ice had been. Somewhere in the greenhouse Neville's Mimbulus Mimbletonia was pushing against its pot and Augusta was writing something in her leather notebook and the owls that had carried 5 copies of a letter had long since returned, their work done. The world had not transformed. But something irreversible had been said in a kitchen in Dorset, and it was said, and it couldn't be unsaid, and the weight of it was different from any weight Harry had carried before, not lighter, exactly, but distributed differently, the difference between carrying something alone and carrying it with people who had chosen to carry it with you. He looked at Dumbledore. "When we get back to school," he said, "I'm starting the DA in the first week." Dumbledore studied him. Then, slowly, "Yes," he said. "I think you should." Chapter 5, Accountability. The Wisengamot Education Subcommittee met in a chamber on the second floor of the Ministry of Magic that most people didn't know existed. Not the grand circular courtroom where trials were held. Harry had been in that room, knew the cold of its stone benches, the way the high walls absorbed sound and gave it back changed, but a smaller room, wood-paneled, with a long table and 14 chairs and windows that looked out onto a corridor rather than anything natural, which gave the whole space the feeling of a room that had been deliberately designed to discourage the sense that there was anything outside it. Augusta had told Harry this detail in advance. She'd told him the layout, the names of the committee members, who would be sympathetic and who would perform sympathy and who would be actively hostile and on what grounds. She'd told him what questions he'd be asked and what questions wouldn't be asked but were implied in the ones that were. She'd told him that he was not required to manage anyone's feelings about what he said and that brevity and directness would be more effective than elaboration. She'd told him all of this over breakfast on the morning of the 8th of January as though she were briefing a junior colleague, which was, Harry had realized over the past week, how Augusta Longbottom expressed respect. Neville had sat across the table and eaten his porridge and added occasional useful clarifications about which subcommittee members had children at Hogwarts. It had felt, Harry thought now, walking into the ministry atrium with Augusta on one side and Neville on the other and Ron and Hermione slightly behind, they'd arrived separately, called as witnesses, Hermione in her best robes, Ron in slightly less best but better than his usual, like the morning before something you'd prepared for, which was different from the morning before something you hadn't, and the difference was the thing Augusta had been building since the 27th of December. The atrium was its usual self, tall and gold and busy with the usual ministry traffic, witches and wizards in robes cutting across each other's paths with the practiced indifference of people who'd made this walk too many times to look up. Several of them recognized Harry, the double take, the nudge, the pointed look, and Harry walked through all of it with the straight back Augusta had told him nothing else would communicate quite as effectively. Hermione caught up with him at the lifts. "Are you ready?" she said, low. "Yes," he said. She searched his face. Hermione's face-searching was one of her most thorough activities. She brought the same comprehensive attention to Harry's expression that she brought to a new textbook, checking it against what she already knew and noting the discrepancies. She found whatever she was looking for and said, "Good. Then, I've prepared a written summary of 6 incidents that I personally witnessed. I've cited the specific passages in the Hogwarts Educational Standards Act that each incident violates." "Of course you have," Ron said, coming up beside her. "Is that a criticism?" "No, it's admiration." 6 different legal passages, Hermione, it's impressive. She looked at him to check whether this was genuine and found that it was. 7, actually, she said. "I found a 7th on the train." Ron looked at Harry. 7, he said. Harry almost smiled. Almost. The chamber was exactly as Augusta had described it, except smaller than Harry had expected from the description and warmer, the air close in a way that heated rooms get when they have too many people in them. The 14 chairs were occupied by 12 of the committee members, 2 seats were empty, which Augusta had explained was a standard political signal meaning we have reservations but not enough to absent ourselves entirely. At the head of the table sat Griselda Marchbanks, a tiny, ancient woman with the expression of someone who had been watching people attempt to be impressive for 80 years and had strong views about the success rate. She looked at Augusta when they came in and gave a single nod of recognition. Augusta returned it. Snape was already there. He was sitting to the left side of the table in a chair that faced the room rather than the table, which was the position for persons being examined. He was in his usual black, hands folded in his lap, his expression carrying the fixed quality of a man who had decided in advance on the register he would maintain and was maintaining it with the effort of someone who finds stillness difficult. He looked at Harry once when Harry came in. Harry looked back. He didn't look away first. He didn't perform anything, not defiance, not triumph, not intimidation. He just looked, for the 2 seconds it took before Snape's eyes moved to the window, and then Harry sat in his chair and focused on the room. Dumbledore was there too. He was seated at the far end, not at the head, Marchbanks had that, but at the end reserved for institutional representatives, which was technically the headmaster's position in a Hogwarts matter. He was in quieter blue again and his hands were on the table and he was looking at the surface of it with the expression Harry had seen in the kitchen in Dorset, present, honest, not performing. Augusta sat beside Harry. Neville sat beside her. Marchbanks called the session to order with the kind of efficiency that comes from having run things for long enough that procedure has become instinct. This subcommittee is convened pursuant to a formal petition submitted by Augusta Longbottom, regarding the conduct of staff at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, specifically relating to the welfare of students in the school's care. The petitioner has provided written accounts from 3 students and 1 staff witness. All materials have been reviewed. She looked at her notes. We'll begin with the petitioner. Augusta stood. Harry watched her. He watched the way she organized herself, not needing a moment, not looking at notes, standing at the table in her best traveling cloak with the exact posture of a woman who has been the most formidable thing in rooms considerably more complicated than this one. She spoke for 20 minutes without stopping and without elaboration that wasn't necessary. She presented the account Harry had written, the incidents, the dates, the pattern. She presented the medical records Madame Pomfrey had sent, which she had requested in a letter whose tone had apparently communicated very clearly that Poppy Pomfrey's professional integrity was the only thing at stake in the choice between compliance and refusal. She presented Neville's account, which Neville had written himself and which was precise and specific in a way that Augusta had looked at with barely concealed satisfaction. She presented the structural argument, not just Snape, but the system that had allowed it. The absence of an independent welfare officer. The headmaster's absolute authority over staff conduct reviews. The lack of an accessible formal complaints process for students. She sat down. Marchbank said, "The subcommittee will hear from Harry Potter directly." Harry stood up. He was aware of the room in the particular heightened way he was aware of things when a lot depended on how he conducted himself in them. He was aware of the 14 faces, curious, skeptical, sympathetic, politically calculating, genuinely troubled, and of Snape in the examination chair to his left and Dumbledore at the far end, and of Augusta beside him who had spent 8 days turning a 15-year-old boy who said "I'm fine" as a reflex into someone who could stand in this room and say "I'm not." He didn't use notes. "Professor Snape's behavior toward me in potions lessons has been consistent since my first year," he said. "It's involved personal comments about my family. Public humiliation in front of classmates. Marks that didn't reflect my work. And on specific occasions, situations in which his behavior directly contributed to physical harm." He paused. "I want to be clear about something, because I think it's important for this room. I'm not here because I dislike Professor Snape or because I want him gone. I'm here because what happened to me is happening to other students. I watched it happen to Neville Longbottom for 5 years. Neville is one of the better herbology students I know, possibly the best in our year, and he failed potions exams he should have passed because the classroom was a place where he'd been told, systematically, that his abilities didn't measure up. That's not teaching. I don't know what to call it, but it's not teaching." He sat down. The room was quiet. One of the subcommittee members, a heavy-set man named Braddock whose name Augusta had flagged as politically calculating, Dumbledore adjacent but not fully committed, said, "Potter, would you say that some of this might reflect a personal conflict between yourself and Professor Snape, rather than a broader pattern of professional misconduct?" Harry looked at him. "I would say that a teacher using a personal conflict as justification for a pattern of behavior toward a student is exactly the definition of professional misconduct." Braddock blinked. Augusta didn't move, but something shifted in her posture that might have been satisfaction. Another member, small, sharp-faced, named Clearwater, Augusta had said genuinely troubled by institutional failure, "Trust her," said, "You mentioned other students. How wide is the pattern in your observation?" "Slytherin students are treated better than non-Slytherin students," Harry said. "Specifically, students whose families Snape has a positive relationship with, and these tend to overlap significantly with former Death Eater families, receive systematically better treatment than other students. I've watched this for 5 years. I don't think it's subtle." Snape's expression didn't change. But something shifted around his eyes. Clearwater wrote something down. Marchbank said, "We'll hear from Hermione Granger." Hermione stood. She was magnificent. Harry thought this without irony, watching her stand at the table with her prepared summary and her 7-sided passages and her Hermione quality memory for specific dates and specific words, and he thought, this is what she's been for 5 years. The person who noticed and remembered and documented, the person who said there are rules about this, Harry and knew exactly which rules, the person whose faith in systems was being tested constantly by the gap between the systems as written and the systems as practiced, and who had not abandoned the faith but had instead decided to force the gap closed. She read from her account. Methodically, thoroughly, with the specific detail of an eyewitness who had been paying careful attention for years. When she cited the 7th passage, a provision in the 1978 Educational Standards Act specifically prohibiting targeted differential treatment based on student background, Braddock leaned over and said something low to the person beside him. Clearwater wrote faster. Marchbanks didn't write anything. She watched Hermione with the expression of a woman confirming what she'd already concluded. Then it was Snape's turn. He stood with the precise controlled movement of a man who had made a decision about who he was going to be in this room and was being it deliberately, and for a moment he simply looked at the subcommittee in a way that communicated, I am here under duress but I am not diminished by the necessity. The students who have testified, he said, and his voice was the voice Harry knew from the dungeon, level, cold, entirely composed, the voice of a man for whom composure was not the absence of emotion but its most lethal deployment, have presented a consistent narrative. I will not dispute every specific incident. There have been moments in my teaching career that, reviewed with the benefit of hindsight and the framing provided by this petition, I would characterize differently. Marchbanks said, characterize how? A brief pause. As excessive. In their personal dimension. Harry waited for the but. The pedagogical methods at Hogwarts in the potions discipline, Snape continued, are designed to produce precision under pressure. The nature of the subject demands it. Students who cannot maintain focus and accuracy under difficult conditions are students who will, in a professional or a dangerous context, make mistakes with consequences that are significantly more severe than a scalded hand. He looked at the table. I have not always calibrated the personal from the pedagogical with the accuracy required. It was, Harry realized, as close to an admission as Snape was capable of producing. It was also, in its way, honest, not honest about everything, not about the deliberate cruelty, not about the imprecision dressed up as confidence said low and private before a grip slipped, but honest about the part of it that could be attributed to methodology rather than malice. Braddock said, Professor Snape, are you aware of any specific welfare guidelines governing student interactions in your classroom? Snape said, the general guidelines, yes. And do you believe your conduct has been consistent with them? Another pause. Longer this time. In specific incidents, no. The room absorbed this. Then Clearwater said, Professor Snape, I'd like to ask you about the occlumency lessons you've been providing to Harry Potter this year. Snape's eyes went to Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at the table. That is a confidential matter related to, it's been noted in the welfare account, Marchbanks said. The committee is entitled to ask about it. Snape looked at the committee. The lessons were arranged to address a specific security risk to the student. And the nature of the lessons? The method? Legilimency, Snape said. Intentional penetration of the student's mental defenses in order to train him to resist it. Clearwater looked at him. A 15-year-old student. By a teacher with whom, by our records today, he has an adversarial relationship. The relationship is complex, Marchbanks said. Yes. We've heard that word several times today. I'd like to move past complexity to a direct question. She looked at Snape with the calm of a woman who has been doing this since before he was born. Do you believe Harry Potter received the best possible version of that instruction from you? The silence that followed was significant not for its length but for its quality. It was not the silence of a man thinking, it was the silence of a man who knew the answer and was deciding whether the answer could be delivered without conceding something he didn't want to concede. No, Snape said. It came out with the specific effort of something that costs more than it looks like it should. Harry sat with this. He looked at the back of Snape's chair and thought about the dungeon and thought about 5 years of it and thought about the specific complexity of a person who was, he believed Augusta about this, believed Dumbledore, had believed it in some dim way even before they'd told him, genuinely brave, genuinely useful, genuinely committed to the side Harry was on, and simultaneously capable of 5 years of that. Of doing that to an 11-year-old child and calling it necessary. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something more complicated than triumphant. Something like the specific grief of understanding that people contain more than one true thing about them simultaneously, and that the presence of courage doesn't cancel the presence of cruelty, and that you can hold both without having to collapse them into one verdict. He thought Snape had never learned this lesson about Harry. Had needed him to be James Potter, had needed the simplification. The hearing continued. Dumbledore stood and spoke, and he said what he'd told Augusta he would say, the acknowledgement, the insufficient oversight, the commitment to structural reform. He said it without the management, without the reframing, with the clear and somewhat uncomfortable honesty of a man doing something that required him to give up a particular story about himself. There were members of the subcommittee who looked surprised. Braddock looked more surprised than anyone, which suggested Dumbledore had not briefed him in advance. Augusta registered Braddock's surprise and wrote something in her notebook. The subcommittee went into deliberation at 1:30. Harry and Neville and Ron and Hermione waited in the corridor outside, which had 3 benches and a window onto the atrium and the specific quality of waiting corridors everywhere, slightly too warm, slightly too narrow, the kind of space designed for temporary occupation that always ends up holding longer stays than intended. Ron sat with his long legs stretched out and his hands in his lap. "You were brilliant in there," he said. "She was brilliant," Harry said, meaning Augusta. "You were too," Hermione said. She was sitting upright, hands folded, processing the last several hours with the thoroughness she applied to post-exam analysis. The moment about what teaching actually means. "When you said I don't know what to call it but it's not teaching. That landed." "I could see Marchbanks react," Neville said. "Marchbanks was already decided," Hermione said. "She decided before she walked in. But the Clearwater woman, she wrote every time Harry said something direct," Neville said. "She stopped writing when Snape was speaking. Because she already had what she needed from him," Hermione said. "The no was the thing. Everything else was context. The no was evidence." Harry leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling of the corridor and felt the strange specific quality of having done the thing and now waiting for what the thing produced, which was different from the anticipation that had preceded it. Less urgent. More tired. Ron said, quietly, "Did you know she had all of that? Pomfrey's records and everything?" "No," Harry said. She started collecting things. After she decided." He thought about Augusta's notebook, the weeks of writing at the desk, the copies of letters. "She's thorough. She's terrifying," Ron said. "In the best way." She walked past Fudge in the atrium and he went white. Harry turned to look at him. Fudge was here. Saw him near the lifts. She looked at him and he found somewhere else to be very quickly. Ron paused. "I didn't know a person could walk in a way that makes other people find somewhere else to be." Hermione said, "It's posture combined with a very specific rate of stride, it's intent," Neville said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at his hands with the thoughtful expression he used when he was saying something he'd been working out for a while. "She means exactly what she says and she doesn't stop and people can tell. That's all it is. People can always tell when someone will actually stop." The corridor was quiet for a moment. "Neville," Hermione said. That was genuinely insightful." Neville looked up. "I've had a lot of time to study it," he said. "Being raised by her." Augusta came out of the chamber at 4. She came into the corridor and looked at the 4 of them with the composed expression she'd maintained since morning, and Harry studied her face for information and found it, as usual, forthcoming only to the degree she decided it should be. She sat on the bench beside Harry and set her handbag on the floor and said, "The deliberation is ongoing. Marchbanks expects a preliminary ruling by 5. We'll wait." "And?" Neville said. She looked at him. "And what? How was it? In there? How did what's the temperature?" She considered this. "Clearwater has been consistent throughout. Marchbanks will write the strongest version of whatever comes out of this. Braddock will compromise, but he'll compromise in the direction of what is documented rather than what's convenient, because he's not unintelligent and the documentation is thorough." She paused. 3 members will abstain or offer minority objections on the grounds of institutional disruption. They are not wrong that disruption will occur, they're simply wrong about who should bear the cost of avoiding it. "And Dumbledore?" Harry said. Augusta turned to him. "His statement changed the room," she said. "Not because it gave them anything they didn't have, but because it removed the option of saying the headmaster disputes it. They can't use Dumbledore as a shield now. He became a witness for the record. She paused. He did that knowing what it would cost him politically. That was, if not a redemption, at least a genuine act. Harry nodded. I want to ask you something, Augusta said, looking at the four of them in the way she had, the direct, evidence-gathering way. While we wait. They waited. Did any of you, at any point in the last 5 years, tell a teacher, any staff member, about Snape's conduct? Hermione said, I told Professor McGonagall in 3rd year. About a comment he made about Harry's marks. She said she'd speak to him. A pause. Nothing changed. Ron said, I complained to Fred and George, who said they'd cursed him once and it hadn't taken. Neville said, I told my Gran. Augusta looked at him steadily. You did, she said. And I should have been paying closer attention years before you needed to tell me. She said it the way she always said the difficult things, cleanly, without softening, accepting the cost of the accuracy. What I intend, when this is concluded, is to speak to Professor McGonagall directly. Not as accusation, but as inquiry about what a head of house can actually do within the current system, and what the system needs to make doing it possible. She's not toothless, Hermione said. She tried. She just operated within a system that made trying insufficient, Augusta said. Yes. That's exactly the problem. She looked at Harry. Systems protect themselves. The only way to change a system is from outside it, by forcing the record to exist somewhere the system can't file it away. She tapped the notebook, which was in her lap. This notebook. The subcommittee. The copies. The record in 5 sets of hands. That's how it's done. Harry looked at the notebook. He thought about all the things that could have been different if one person had been keeping a notebook 4 years ago. 3 years ago. He thought about the weight that had accumulated, slowly, over 5 years, landing blow by blow in lessons twice a week, and about the particular skill he'd developed for absorbing it, and about whether he'd have needed that skill if one person had been watching and writing. I'm going to keep one, he said. Augusta looked at him. A record, he said. Going forward. Not just about Snape, about anything. I'm going to document things. He paused. I've spent 5 years trusting that if I just got through things, the bigger picture would take care of itself. It won't. Things only get taken care of if someone is watching and writing and making it impossible to pretend they didn't happen. Hermione reached into her bag and produced a blank notebook. She set it on the bench beside him. Harry looked at her. I bought 4, she said. 1 each. Ron picked his up. He turned it in his hands. Are we doing is this a group thing now? Record keeping? Because I want it noted that this is the most Hermione idea we've ever had. It was Harry's idea, Hermione said. It was Augusta's idea, Harry said, looking at her. Augusta said nothing. But she looked at the 4 of them in the corridor, Hermione with her 7-sided passages, Ron with his easy loyalty that was deeper than it looked, Neville with the quiet groundedness of someone who'd spent a week becoming more himself, and Harry with the blank notebook on his knee, and her expression was the one Neville had described the night he'd told her everything, the one that was revising a book she thought she'd already finished reading. The preliminary ruling came at 5:10. Marchbanks brought it out herself, which Augusta said later was unusual and significant. She stood in the doorway of the chamber and read it aloud in the corridor, which Harry thought was either procedure or a deliberate choice to have it said in this specific space, with the 4 students sitting on benches and the daylight going grey in the atrium windows beyond. The ruling, a formal finding of insufficient welfare oversight at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, with a requirement for the establishment of an independent student welfare officer position by the start of the next academic year. A formal review of Professor Snape's teaching conduct, with conditions attached to his continued employment, the specifics to be developed over the following month with input from the headmaster and the reviewing committee. A recommendation that the acclimacy instruction be transferred to a different teacher to be determined by the headmaster in consultation with the student's welfare. And a general finding that the complaints process for students at Hogwarts required restructuring, with an independent review body to whom complaints could be escalated outside the direct reporting line. She finished reading. She looked at Augusta over her glasses. The full ruling will be published in the Wisengamot proceedings within 30 days. Published, Augusta confirmed. Not filed. Published, Marchbanks said, with the same weight Augusta had put on the word. She went back inside. The corridor was quiet. Neville exhaled very slowly. Hermione was sitting with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright in the specific way they got when an institution worked the way it was supposed to, which was her version of the feeling Harry had in a good defense lesson, the feeling of a thing being used correctly. Ron said, "Blimey." Harry was looking at the closed door of the chamber. He was thinking about going back to Hogwarts next week. About the DA in the first week. About the blank notebook in his hands. About Snape in the examination chair saying no with the specific effort of something that cost more than it looked like it should. He was thinking about Neville in the greenhouse saying the person who built this is not the person Snape describes, those two things can't both be true, and about himself, standing at the gate of Privet Drive, watching Augusta walk away in the green cloak, feeling something tighten in his chest and then loosen. He was thinking about the room on the 4th floor of St. Mungo's. The drawer with the newspaper clippings. Alice Longbottom's hands turning the parchment over and over, and Neville taking the wrapper and saying thank you and meaning it. Augusta sat beside him and said nothing. He said, "Thank you." She said, "The work isn't finished." "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." She looked at him, the full, direct, unfiltered look that saw the person rather than the version of the person, and then she picked up her handbag from the floor and stood up with the decisive motion of a woman moving to the next item on the list. "Dinner," she said. "I know a restaurant near the Leaky Cauldron. All 5 of us." Ron was already standing. "Please tell me it's the kind of place where the portions are, it's the kind of place where you won't ask about the portions," Augusta said, walking toward the lift. Ron looked at Harry. Harry almost smiled. Then he did smile. It arrived the way things did when you weren't expecting them, without permission, without calculation, because the thing in front of you was simply good and your face knew it before you did. He stood up. He put the blank notebook in his bag. He walked toward the lift with the people who had shown up, not because he was useful, not because of the scar or the prophecy or the story the world had written for him, but because Neville had told his Gran, and Augusta had stood up, and sometimes that was all it took to change the shape of the thing you were carrying. Sometimes that was everything. Chapter 6, After the Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 on the 10th of January, which was later than the usual September departure and felt different for it, the platform less crowded, the light lower, the cold a working cold rather than the fresh start cold of autumn. Harry stood at the window of their compartment and watched the city go backwards past him, the grey terraces and the industrial edges and then the first suggestion of countryside, and thought about the fact that he was going back differently than he'd left. Not transformed. Nothing so clean as that. But different in the specific way that things are different when something has been named that was previously only felt, the difference between carrying a weight you can't describe and carrying one you can, which sounds like it should be heavier and turns out to be lighter, because the naming gives you somewhere to put your hands. Ron was asleep within 15 minutes of departure, which was one of his most reliable qualities. Hermione had her notebook open, the one she'd bought in the set of 4, already half filled with a system of documentation Harry didn't entirely understand but which had, knowing Hermione, cross-referencing and indexing and probably a color-coded margin system that she'd explain if asked and that he would understand approximately 60% of and find genuinely useful anyway. Neville was reading a herbology journal that had arrived the morning they left, a thick quarterly publication that looked extremely serious and had an article in it that Neville had pointed out, with the specific restrained excitement of someone who knows enthusiasm about this particular subject will not land universally, on a new grafting technique for magical root systems. He'd been reading it in the same concentrated way he moved around the greenhouse, fully present, entirely at home. Harry opened his own notebook. He wrote the date at the top. He thought for a moment and then wrote, "First week back. Start the day." He looked at this. Then he wrote underneath it, "Not because Umbridge. Because Neville was right, we know what's coming. Prepare." He paused. Then he wrote, "Things that are different now." He started a list. Not for the subcommittee, not for Augusta, just for himself, the record of what the last 2 weeks had shifted, which he wanted to have somewhere outside his own head where he could look at it when the old habits came back, when the reflex to say "I'm fine" and absorb things and make himself small reasserted itself, as he knew it would. He wrote, "Augusta." He thought about what to write next and settled on, "Somebody showed up." It was simple enough to be accurate. He wrote, "Neville told her." He sat with the weight of that for a moment. 5 years of navigating a school that had one safe place in it and multiple unsafe ones, and it was Neville, quiet, underestimated, systematically told he didn't belong there by the person most responsible for making him feel like he did, who had sat on a train with something difficult and carried it all the way home and put it in front of the one person he trusted to act on it. He wrote, "Dumbledore owes me a conversation. Going to make sure it happens." He wrote, "A clemency, actual lessons, not whatever those were." He looked at the list. He added, "The DA first week. Everyone." Hermione looked up from her notebook. "What are you writing?" "Notes." She looked at him for a moment. "Notes about what?" "Plans," he said. "And things I don't want to forget." She looked at his notebook the way she looked at all notebooks, with the warm specific regard of someone for whom written records are a form of affection, and then went back to her own. "I've drafted a letter to Madame Bones," she said, as though this were a natural continuation of the previous sentence. "About the independent welfare officer position. The ruling gives them a year to establish it, which is too long." "How much too long?" "Considerably. I've cited 3 precedents where similar positions were established in under 3 months when there was sufficient administrative will." "And you're going to tell Madame Bones that the administrative will should be sufficient?" "I'm going to provide the information," Hermione said, and let her draw her own conclusions. Ron opened one eye. "That's what you say when you've already drawn the conclusions and you're going to make the other person feel like they came to them independently." "That is a legitimate communication strategy," Hermione said. Ron closed his eye. "It absolutely is. I'm just noting it." Neville turned a page of his journal. "Augusta does the same thing," he said. "She provides information. She never tells you what to think. She just makes what she thinks impossible to not think once you have everything she's given you." Harry looked out the window. The countryside was properly itself now, hills, winter-pale fields, bare hedgerows, the occasional farm building passing with the solid permanence of things that have been in one place long enough to become part of the landscape. He thought about Longbottom Manor and the greenhouse and the morning light through old glass in the east bedroom and about waking up without dreaming for 3 nights in a row. He thought about what was waiting for him at Hogwarts. Umbridge and her educational decrees and the particular brand of smiling malice that he'd spent the first term running up against and finding no purchase on because it operated by making resistance look unreasonable. Snape, who would be back in the dungeon, who had a formal review condition attached to him now, who would, Harry didn't know what. Snape was not a man who would process public accountability in any way Harry could easily predict. He might be colder. He might be more controlled. He might, in some darker scenario, decide that Harry was now a specific target in a way that went beyond the old pattern. He thought about the notebook. He thought about "I'm going to document things." He thought about the 5 copies of the letter, and the information in 5 sets of hands, and the way Augusta had explained the principle: the only way to change a system is from outside it, by forcing the record to exist somewhere the system can't file it away. He was going back with a notebook and a plan and 4 people who were all carrying notebooks and a ruling from the Wisengamot subcommittee that was being published in 30 days. He was going back differently, and the difference mattered even if no one at Hogwarts could immediately see it, because it wasn't about what was visible, it was about what was true. He was done making himself small in spaces that wanted him small. He wrote that in a notebook too. Hogwarts in January was a particular version of itself, the cold sharper inside the stone corridors than the grounds outside, the fires working overtime in the common rooms, the smell of the school which was always the same and which Harry had, over 5 years, come to associate with specific and contradictory things simultaneously, safety and danger, belonging and difficulty. The place he'd come home to and the place he'd learned to be careful in. He stood at the entrance hall with his trunk and looked up at the staircase. He was home. He hated parts of it and it was home. Both things. McGonagall met them in the entrance hall with the composed brisk manner she used when she was managing several things at once, which was most of the time. She looked at Harry with an expression he couldn't quite read, not the usual one, not just the general assessment of whether he'd made it back in one piece, and said, "A word, Potter, Longbottom. The rest of you get your things to your dormitories." Ron and Hermione went upstairs. Ron glanced back once, Harry gave him a brief nod that meant it's fine, I'll tell you later. McGonagall led them into her office and closed the door and turned and looked at them both, and her expression was not what Harry expected. He'd been bracing for the institutional version, the version that operated inside the same system that had allowed everything that had been documented, the version that deflected through process. He didn't get that version. What he got was Minerva McGonagall with her guard lowered by approximately 20%, which in her terms was considerable. "I received a letter from Augusta Longbottom," she said. "Right," Neville said. "Yes," Neville said. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should know, both of you, that I attempted 3 formal complaints regarding Professor Snape's conduct during your first 3 years. All 3 were reviewed internally and no action was taken." She said it with the specific flatness of someone delivering a fact they have made peace with because making peace with it was the only option available. "I am aware that knowledge of those attempts provides limited comfort given the outcome. I am providing it because the alternative is allowing you to conclude that no one was paying attention." Harry looked at her. "Someone was paying attention," she said. "The system's failure was not the same thing as the individual failure of everyone within it." She paused. "I want to make it clear that I consider myself partially responsible for the outcome nonetheless." The office was quiet. Harry said, "I know you tried." She met his eyes. "I do know that," he said. I needed someone outside the system." "Yes," she said. "That is precisely correct. And I should have facilitated that sooner rather than relying on internal process." She straightened slightly. "Going forward, if you have concerns, either of you, I would like you to come to me first. Not because I am the ideal route, but because I am a route, and I intend to be a more effective one than I have been." Neville said, "Yes, Professor." McGonagall looked at him with the expression of someone revising a reading of something. Not dramatically. Slightly. The way good readers revise, not abandoning the text but understanding it more fully. "You've grown up, Longbottom," she said. It wasn't quite a compliment and it wasn't quite an observation. It was an acknowledgement, which from McGonagall was worth more than either. Neville stood up a little straighter. "I've had a good Christmas," he said. The DA meeting was on Thursday. Harry had sent the coins out on Tuesday, the modified galleons, Hermione's enchantment still working perfectly, and set the date, and by Wednesday evening he knew who was coming because the corridor outside the room of requirement had a particular quality of quiet that meant people were aware of it and moving past it on purpose. 42 people came. He'd expected fewer. The summer and the Prophet and the Ministry's campaign had done something to the social arithmetic of believing Harry Potter, had made it a thing you announced rather than a thing you simply did, had made it cost something, and costs changed numbers. He'd been prepared for 20. He'd told himself 20 was fine, 20 was enough, you start with 20 and you build. 42 people came through the door of the room of requirement on Thursday evening and the room accommodated them with the comfortable indifference of a space that had been built for exactly the variable demands of the thing being needed in it. Harry stood at the front of the room and looked at them. He knew most of their faces. Some he knew well, Ron and Hermione and Neville in the front, Luna Lovegood slightly to one side with her characteristic expression of general benevolent attention, Ginny Weasley with her arms folded and her chin up, the Weasley twins slightly apart from the group in the way they always stood, together but separate from whatever formation everyone else was taking. Some he knew less well. There were 4 fifth-years from Hufflepuff who had never spoken to him directly. A second-year Ravenclaw girl who looked slightly too young for whatever she'd decided she was here for and whose expression made it clear she'd thought about that and showed up anyway. A boy from Gryffindor whose name Harry was embarrassed to realize he'd never fully retained, who'd been in his year since first year and whom he'd consistently not quite noticed. He noticed him now. "I'm not going to give a speech," Harry said. "You know what this is. It's the same as last term, except we're starting earlier and I want it to be more systematic." He paused. "Some of you know things already. Some of you are starting from the beginning. That's fine, we work in mixed groups and the people who know things teach the people who don't, and that means everyone gets better faster." He looked around the room. "One rule. What happens in this room is yours. You decide what you do with what you learn here. I'm not training anyone for a specific purpose or a specific fight. I'm teaching you to defend yourselves because the world right now is one where that matters." Silence. Then Neville said, "He's right about the world." It landed with a specific weight because it was Neville, because everyone in the room knew Neville's story in some version, knew what his family name meant and what it had cost and who had been made to pay that cost, and because he said it plainly, without drama, as a simple fact rather than a rallying cry. 2 people near the back started to pair up. "Start with Expelliarmus," Harry said. "Everyone. I don't care what level you are, if you can't disarm someone reliably in 3 seconds, that's the thing you fix first." The room filled with the sound of practice. Harry moved through the pairs. He corrected grips and stances and wand angles with the specific attention of someone who had learned from Mad-Eye Moody and Lupin and 3 years of actual combat and knew the difference between the textbook description of a spell and the lived understanding of what it needed to work under pressure. He corrected without condescension and he challenged without embarrassment, and when someone got something right he said so and moved on. He stopped at Neville's pair. Neville was working with the second-year Ravenclaw girl, whose name turned out to be Clara Benson, who had excellent instincts and was overcorrecting on the wand angle because she'd read a book that had the angle wrong. Neville was telling her this with the patient directness of someone who knew the material and had also, at some point, been the person who needed someone to say something patient and direct. "Higher than you think," Neville said. "Not the way the textbook shows, that's the formal stance for exam conditions. For actual use, you want, like this?" Clara adjusted. "Perfect," Neville said. "Try it. Expelliarmus." The spell caught Neville's wand cleanly and he retrieved it from the air with the reflexive ease of someone who'd been doing this for a year. "Again," he said. "And this time keep your weight forward." Harry watched him for a moment. The greenhouse, he thought. The same thing. The clarity of being in the thing you're built for. He moved on. After, when the room had emptied and it was just Harry and Ron and Hermione and Neville in the returned silence of the room of requirement, they sat on the floor in the way you sit on the floor when you're tired, in the good way, the tired that comes from having done something useful rather than the tired that comes from having endured something. Hermione was writing in her notebook, observations from the session, Harry assumed, probably already organized into categories. Ron was lying on his back looking at the ceiling. 42, he said. "Yeah," Harry said. "That's more than last time before the Christmas break." "Yeah. They came back," Ron said. "Not surprised exactly. But registering it, the way you register something you hoped for without quite letting yourself be certain of. After the Prophet and Umbridge and all of it. They came back. They were always going to," Neville said. He was sitting with his knees up, turning the modified galleon over in his hand. "They just needed someone to tell them it was worth coming back to." Harry leaned against the wall and thought about the 42 faces and about the boy whose name he'd learned tonight, Michael Adeyemi, who had terrible form on Expelliarmus and extraordinary instincts on everything else, who had apparently been trying to get into the DA since October and hadn't known the coin system and had asked 3 separate people and none of them had known to tell him, and Harry had found this out during a break and had filed it under the things that fall through gaps when there isn't a system and had written it in his notebook afterward. The notebook was already filling up. He thought about Augusta's notebook. About the subcommittee ruling and the published record and the formal review condition. He thought about Snape, who had been in his first potions lesson back with the precise controlled stillness of someone who had made a decision about their behavior and was implementing it consciously, which was different from the old behavior even if the surface temperature of the room was similar. The lesson had been, not good, exactly, but different in its specific quality. Snape had not spoken to Harry personally at all, which was itself a form of assessment. The man understood that he was being watched now, that every interaction existed in a context of documentation, that the option of the low private comment had been removed. Harry didn't know what to make of it yet. He was keeping records. "What do you think Umbridge will do?" Hermione said, looking up from her notebook. "When she finds out about tonight." "She already knows," Harry said. "She's always known, she just hasn't been able to prove it." He paused. "She'll try harder. And we keep going." He said it simply. "We keep the coins, we keep the records, we keep meeting. She can make it harder, she can't make it not true that 42 people came through that door tonight and learned to disarm someone properly." Ron rolled his head to look at him. "You're different," he said. Harry looked at him. "I don't mean," Ron searched for it. "You're the same, but the way you said that. We keep going. You used to say things like that and it sounded like you were bracing against something. That just sounded like a fact." Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about Privet Drive. About the gate and the green cloak and Augusta walking away with certainty in every step. He thought about the kitchen in Dorset and Dumbledore's hands on the table and "I owe you an apology," not the kind that asks you to understand the complexity. He thought about the corridor outside the subcommittee chamber and Neville saying sometimes that's actually all there is to it and the blank notebook on his knee and Hermione producing 3 more without asking. "Something happened," he said. "Over Christmas. Not one big thing, several things. Someone showed up." He paused. "And I don't think I knew what that felt like before. Someone just showing up because the thing needed addressing and they were the person who could address it. Not because of the prophecy or the war or what I am in the big story. Just because I was a person getting burned in a classroom and that was reason enough." The room was quiet. Ron was looking at him with the expression he used when something important was happening and he was listening to all of it. Hermione had set down her quill. "Neville did that," Harry said. "He told her. He went home and he told her and she came." He looked at Neville. "That was you. That was your thing. I want you to know I know that." Neville said, "Harry, I mean it. I've been saying thank you for a week and I mean it more every time." He was direct about it, the way Augusta was direct about things, without softening it into something easier to receive. "You saw me. And then you did something about what you saw. That's not small. That's actually enormous." Neville looked at him for a long moment. "You'd have done the same," he said, the same thing he'd said at the gate of Longbottom Manor, which Harry had disputed then and was not disputing now because the point wasn't the dispute. "Maybe," Harry said. "I'm trying to be the kind of person who would." Hermione picked up her quill. She didn't write anything immediately, she just held it, and her expression was the one she used when she was feeling something and had decided to feel it rather than analyze it, which was the more mature Hermione, the one that had been developing over the last couple of years and which Harry found, consistently, more comfortable to be around. "The 4 notebooks," she said. "Yeah," Ron said. "I think we keep them," she said. "Not just for this, for everything. The whole year. Records of what happens, what's said, what's decided, and by whom. Not just Snape. Everything. She looked at Harry. She was right. The record existing somewhere, the system can't file it away. That principle doesn't stop applying when the subcommittee adjourns. Harry thought about this. The DA sessions, he said. Keep records of who attends, what we cover, what we observe about the school. Not names in a list that Umbridge can find, in code. Something she can't read. Hermione looked at him. I can develop a cipher. A double index system, cross-referenced, obviously, Ron said, not unkindly. I'll have it by the weekend, she said, and wrote something in her notebook with the satisfied momentum of someone who has found the next useful thing. 3 weeks later, Augusta's letter arrived at breakfast. Harry was eating when the tawny owl he'd started to recognize landed beside his plate with the usual letter sealed in green wax. He opened it while the others watched with the unsubtle attention of people who have learned that letters from Augusta Longbottom tend to contain information worth having. Harry, the full Wisengamot ruling was published in the proceedings this morning, as promised. I have attached the relevant pages. The finding regarding welfare oversight has already been cited in 2 separate ministry inquiries that were waiting for exactly this kind of precedent. Griselda Marchbanks tells me the Education Subcommittee is discussing permanent structural reforms for the autumn. I have been asked to serve as a consulting member. I have agreed. The formal review of Professor Snape's conduct begins on the 14th. You will not be required to attend. Your written account will be submitted as evidence. I will keep you informed of the outcome. Regarding your other situation, I have spoken with the relevant parties, and the question of where you spend the summers going forward is no longer solely at the discretion of those who have historically made poor decisions about it. You will have options. We will discuss them at Easter. I expect you are working hard. I expect Neville is doing the same. Tell him to write more often. His last letter was 3 lines. Augusta P.S. The apple pastry recipe is from Fig's family. I have obtained it. You may have it at Easter. Harry read the letter twice. Then he looked up and passed it to Neville, who read it and passed it to Hermione, who read it and passed it to Ron, who read it and put it down and said, options for the summers. What does that mean? I think it means she's making sure I don't have to go back, Harry said. He said it carefully, not wanting to get the size of it wrong, not wanting to overstate or understate the thing. Not forever, maybe. But I have options. He'd never had options about that before. Not real ones. The summer had always been the same as Privet Drive had always been, the given, the immovable, the thing arranged above him that couldn't be argued with because no one had thought to argue with it on his behalf. Someone had thought to argue with it. He looked out the great hall windows. The February morning was pale and cold and perfectly clear, the sky the sharp winter blue that had been there on New Year's Day when they'd gone to St. Mungo's, and he'd stood inside the door of room 49 and chosen to look. Hermione said, she's going to be on the subcommittee permanently. Of course she is, Neville said, and he sounded, not proud exactly, because pride was a thing you felt for someone you'd given something to, and what he felt was simpler and less possessive than that. He sounded like someone looking at a person they recognized. She'd been watching those institutions mishandle things for 30 years. She was always going to end up inside them, doing it properly. Harry thought about that. About what it meant for an institution to have Augusta Longbottom in it, permanently, with a notebook and a commitment to making the record exist somewhere it couldn't be filed away. He thought it probably meant the institution would be different within a year in ways it couldn't fully anticipate yet. He thought about Neville telling her on December 27th at the dinner table. One conversation. One act of trust between a boy and his grandmother, the specific bravery of saying there is something wrong and you are the person I'm choosing to tell. And from that, Augusta in the atrium of the ministry, the copies in 5 sets of hands, Dumbledore's hands on the kitchen table saying I owe you an apology, the ruling published in the proceedings, the structures beginning to shift, the 42 people in the room of requirement learning to disarm someone in 3 seconds. The way things moved in the world, Harry thought. Not the dramatic sudden transformation of stories, not one great blow that changed everything. But the specific chain of small courageous acts, one following from another, each one making the next one possible, the whole sequence invisible until you looked back at where it had started and traced it forward. It had started with Neville watching a grip slip. He wrote to Augusta that evening. He sat at the desk in the dormitory after everyone else had gone down to the common room, and he wrote to her the way he was learning to write to her, directly, without the managed distance he used to put between himself and the people he wrote to, the distance that said, "I know the letter might not reach you safely, I know things might go wrong, I am preemptively protecting you from my full weight by keeping something back." He wrote, "Augusta, the ruling is up on the bulletin board in the common room. Hermione put it up this morning. Several people read it and asked me about it. I told them what happened, not all of it, but enough. 3 more people asked about the DA. I'm keeping the notebook. Hermione has a cipher working, it's very good, very Hermione, I'll describe it in the next letter. Neville is doing well. He corrected someone's transfiguration stance in the common room yesterday without anyone asking him to. They thanked him and he looked surprised, which I think means he expected them not to. He's getting better at accepting that he knows things." He stopped. He thought about what to write next and found himself not managing it, not calculating the correct distance. He wrote, "I want to tell you something and I'm going to say it plainly because that's what you do and I'm trying to do it too. I've spent a long time not knowing what it felt like when someone showed up. I knew the absence of it, I knew what the negative space was shaped like, I've been living in the shape of it my whole life. But I didn't know what the presence of it felt like until the 27th of December. You showed up. You walked into that house and you sat down and you said someone should have done this years ago and you didn't soften it and you didn't ask me to make it easier for you to have said it. You just said it and then you picked up your quill. I don't know how to say thank you in a way that's the right size for what that was. But I'm trying. The apple pastry would be a good start at Easter." Harry he read it back. He didn't change anything. He folded it and sealed it and attached it to Hedwig's leg, and she looked at him with the bright amber eyes that he'd looked into more than almost anyone's over the past 5 years, and butted her head against his chin once, which was her consistent and specific language for things she chose not to put into words. "I know," he said. She took off into the February night. Harry sat at the desk for a while after, not doing anything in particular, just sitting with the quiet of the dormitory and the sound of the castle, the distant conversations from the common room below, the wind at the tower windows, the small sounds of a building that was continuously, quietly, living. He thought about Voldemort. Not with the cold pulse of dread but with the clear hard thing he'd found in room 49 on New Year's Day, the "This is why." He thought about what was coming, the year, the war, the things Augusta had said about knowing what you faced and knowing it clearly, and he thought about facing it as the person he currently was rather than the person he'd been in September. The person in September had been absorbing things alone. The person now had a notebook and 4 people who had notebooks and a woman in Dorset who was joining a subcommittee and who would not stop until the structures had been properly interrogated, and a headmaster who had said "I owe you an apology" and meant it. And a dormitory he was going back to in a minute where Ron was almost certainly starting a game of exploding snap and Neville was probably talking to someone about herbology and the fire was going. He was still Harry Potter. He still had the scar and the prophecy and the war that was coming toward all of them whether they were ready or not. None of that had changed. But he was not the version of himself that made himself small in spaces that wanted him small. That version was done. He stood up. He picked up the notebook and his wand and he went to the door, and he stopped and looked back at the room, the beds, the curtains, the old stone walls, the window with its February sky, and he thought, "This is mine. I'm not a visitor here. I'm not a problem being housed. I'm a person who belongs somewhere and this is one of the places." He'd never quite thought that before. It was good. It was a good thought to have. He went downstairs. Ron had exploding snap out. Hermione was reading but following the game with the peripheral attention of someone who claimed not to be interested and was. Neville was talking to Seamus about something that involved animated hand gestures and what sounded like it might be a story about a venomous tentacula. Ginny was in the good chair by the fire. Luna was sitting cross-legged on the hearthrug reading the Quibbler upside down. Harry sat down. Ron dealt him in. The fire went. Outside, somewhere in the February dark, Hedwig was moving toward Dorset with a letter that said exactly what it meant, and Augusta Longbottom was in her study at the writing desk with her notebook and her commitment and her immovable intention, and in a hospital on the 4th floor of St. Mungo's a drawer held newspaper clippings and a leaf from a winter garden, and in the greenhouse at Longbottom Manor a plant pressed against the walls of a pot that was too small for it, growing toward spring. The world hadn't transformed. But something irreversible had happened inside all of them, the specific irreversibility of people who have been seen clearly and chosen to remain visible, who have said this is the thing, these are the facts, someone should have done this years ago and found that saying it out loud was the first and most necessary step toward anything that came after. That step had been taken. Everything else was what came after.